Clara Whitmore's boots hit the platform and her whole body went cold, not from the Montana wind, but from the stranger's words. "Ma'am, Nathaniel Carter ain't coming. He don't want you." 2 suitcases. A crowd of strangers already laughing behind gloved hands. A promise broken before she'd even said hello. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the dust and never be seen again. But the tall cowboy standing before her, the very man who'd just shattered her whole future, wasn't finished talking. "But I ain't gonna leave you standing here alone," he said. "Not today, not ever. If you're watching this from wherever you are tonight, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and if you believe love can find you even in the darkest hour of your life. Hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end." The train whistle was still screaming when Clara Whitmore stepped down onto the platform at Red Hollow, Montana, and felt the whole world tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the handles of her 2 suitcases so hard her knuckles went white. Steam rolled past her skirts. Strangers pushed by her in both directions, men in dusty hats, women clutching baskets, a boy dragging a crate twice his size. Nobody looked at her twice. And still, she had never in her life felt so exposed. She scanned the platform. A tall man. That was all she knew. Nathaniel Carter had written that he would be tall, that he would be wearing a gray coat, that he would be holding her photograph so she would know him at once. She saw no gray coat. She saw no photograph raised in a stranger's hand. Her heart began to hammer. "Don't panic," she told herself. "Don't you dare panic, Clara Whitmore. You have survived worse than a late bridegroom." But she hadn't survived worse than this. Not really. She had survived hunger. She had survived the bankman's cold eyes as he nailed the foreclosure notice to her father's barn door. She had survived 3 years of taking in other people's mending by candlelight, until her fingers bled 3 years of watching her mother's cough grow worse in a house that was no longer theirs to keep warm. She had survived all of it by believing that somewhere ahead of her there was a door that would finally open into something steady. Something safe. She had believed Nathaniel Carter's letters were that door. "Miss Whitmore." The voice came low and even, cutting clean through the noise of the platform. Clara turned, and there he was. He was not wearing a gray coat. He was wearing a weathered brown duster with the collar turned up against the wind, and a hat pulled low enough that she had to tilt her head to see his eyes. He was younger than she expected a man like Nathaniel Carter to be, younger, harder, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and shoulders that filled out the doorway of the world around him. His skin was sun-browned deep, the kind of brown that only came from years under an open sky. He was not smiling. He did not look like a man who smiled easily. "Yes," Clara said, and hated how her voice shook on the single word. "I'm Clara Whitmore." "Cole Harrison." He touched the brim of his hat, a small formal gesture that seemed strange coming from a man built like a fortress. "I own the ranch neighboring the Carter place." Clara's stomach dropped straight through the platform boards. "Neighboring," she repeated. "Then where is Mr. Carter? Is he unwell? Has something happened?" Cole Harrison's jaw tightened. She watched him take a breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he is about to do something he does not want to do, but intends to do anyway because the alternative is worse. "Nothing's happened to him, ma'am," he said. "He's fine. He's home. Sitting in his father's parlor drinking his father's coffee, same as he does every morning." "Then why isn't he here?" Cole looked at her for a long moment. Around them the platform had begun to thin passengers, scattering toward waiting wagons and waiting families, but Clara barely noticed. All she could see was the stranger in front of her, and the terrible patience in his eyes, like a man steadying himself to deliver a blow he could not soften, no matter how he tried. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to tell you the truth before anyone else does, and before you hear it twisted into something crueler than it already is." She felt her breath catch. "Nathaniel Carter changed his mind." The words landed like stones dropped one at a time into still water. "He what?" His family talked him out of it. His mother mostly. She never wanted him marrying a stranger from the East mail order or not. Last week they told him plain marry a woman from a name they know or don't marry at all and keep the inheritance clean. He picked the inheritance. Cole's voice did not rise. It did not soften either. He said it the way a man reads out a debt that's come due. He asked me to come meet your train. Said it wasn't fair to leave you standing here not knowing. He asked you, Clara said slowly, to tell me he doesn't want me. Yes, ma'am. And he couldn't come and say it himself. No, ma'am. Something in Clara's chest cracked open quiet and total like ice giving way beneath a boot. She had crossed 4 states for this. She had sold her mother's wedding ring for the train fare. She had spent 11 nights on hard benches and 1 on a station floor in Ohio because she couldn't afford a room, telling herself the whole time that it would be worth it, that on the other side of all that misery, there would be a home waiting a man who had promised her stability and asked for nothing false in return. He hadn't even come to tell her himself. He doesn't want you here, Cole said again, softer this time, because he could see it landing, see the color draining out of her face. I'm sorry. There ain't a decent way to say a thing like that. I figured a hard truth quick was kinder than a soft lie that strings you along. Clara looked past him. She realized all at once that people were watching. A cluster of women near the ticket window had stopped their conversation entirely, their eyes moving between Clara and Cole with open, hungry curiosity. A man loading a wagon had paused with a crate half lifted, watching the scene, the way a man watches a fight he expects to get interesting. Somewhere behind her, she heard a woman's voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Another one. Another mail-order bride left standing right there on the platform. Lord, you'd think they'd learn. Desperate is what it is. No decent woman needs to travel 2,000 miles to find a husband. Clara's face burned. She had heard variations of that sentence. Her whole journey whispered on the train, murmured in waiting rooms, printed in the disapproving arch of strangers' eyebrows. She had told herself she was past caring what people thought. She discovered standing on that platform, with her whole future in ashes at her feet, that she was not past caring at all. She was simply very good at pretending. For a moment, standing there on that platform, Clara was not in Montana at all. She was back in Missouri, 3 years gone, standing in the doorway of her father's barn, while a man in a black coat hammered a foreclosure notice into the wood. She remembered the sound of it, 3 sharp cracks of the hammer final as a judge's gavel, and her father's hand trembling on her shoulder, and her mother's cough rattling from the house behind them. Already worse than it had any right to be. At her age, worsened by winters spent burning less wood than the cold demanded, so there'd be coin left for medicine that never quite worked as promised. She remembered the year after that, taking in mending by candlelight until her eyes ached and her fingertips split and bled at the seams. Selling the good china first, then the modest jewelry, then finally her mother's wedding ring, the one her mother had made her promise in the last clear-headed week before the end to keep for herself and never sell no matter how bad things got. She had sold it anyway, for train fare, for a chance at Nathaniel Carter's letters, which had promised nothing extravagant, only a roof, a name, a future that did not depend on the mercy of neighbors who had already given all the mercy they had to spare. She had told herself boarding that train that her mother would have understood, that surviving mattered more than sentiment. She had told herself a great many things in 11 days of hard benches and harder floors, and she had believed most of them because believing was the only thing keeping her upright. And now the man she'd crossed 4 states for hadn't even found the courage to look her in the eye and say he'd changed his mind. She lifted her chin anyway. It was the only weapon she had left. Well, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I suppose I've traveled a very long way for nothing. Not for nothing, Cole said. No. Something bitter cracked through in her tone before she could stop it. Forgive me, Mr. Harrison, but I don't see how you'd know that. You're not the one who just found out he sold off his whole life on the promise of a man who couldn't even look him in the eye and tell the truth. She expected him to flinch. Men usually did, when she let that particular edge show, the one her mother used to call unbecoming, the one that had gotten her called difficult more than once by people who preferred their women quiet and grateful. Cole Harrison did not flinch. He looked at her steady, the way a man looks at a horse that's about to bolt, not with fear, but with respect for what it might do. "You're allowed to be angry, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'd think less of you if you weren't." That stopped her cold. Nobody had said that to her. Not once in 3 years of losing everything had a single person told her she was allowed to be angry about it. She had been told to be grateful for the mending work, grateful for the charity of neighbors, grateful even for Nathaniel Carter's letters, as though the mere fact that a stranger had offered her a way out of poverty was itself a gift she owed endless thanks for, regardless of what he did with the offer afterward. "I don't need your permission to be angry," she said, quieter now. "No, ma'am. Reckon you don't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The women by the ticket window had drifted closer, not even pretending not to listen anymore. Clara felt their eyes on her back like heat. "If it's all the same to you," she said, "I'd like to know where the return train departs from. I'll need the schedule." "You don't have the fare for a return train." It wasn't a question. Clara's silence confirmed it before she could think to deny it. She had spent every last coin on the trip out. She had told herself the whole 11 days that she would not need money once she arrived because Nathaniel Carter had promised a home, a table, a name. She had not planned for the possibility that promise would evaporate on a train platform in front of strangers. Cole watched her work through it, watched the arithmetic play out behind her eyes, watched her arrive at the answer he'd already arrived at himself. "Come with me," he said. "I beg your pardon. Not like that." A muscle in his jaw shifted, and for the first time something like discomfort crossed his face. Not at her, she realized, but at himself, at the position he was in, standing in front of a humiliated stranger with an offer that could easily be misread. "My ranch has been short-handed in the house for near 2 years. My housekeeper passed this past winter, and I never hired another. Place is falling apart at the seams, accounts a mess, men eating standing up because there's no order to a meal anymore. I need somebody who can run a household. You need somewhere to be that isn't a train platform, 6 months, wages, a room of your own with a lock on the door. Nothing more asked of you than honest work." Clara stared at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a job," he confirmed, "because you feel guilty for what your neighbor did." "Because it's the decent thing to do," Cole said, "and because my ranch genuinely needs the help, and I'd be a liar if I said those two reasons weren't tangled together. But I ain't asking you to be grateful for it, Miss Whitmore. I'm asking if you want work, that's all." Behind her, one of the women by the ticket window said something Clara didn't catch, and another laughed a short, ugly sound. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck. She thought of the return fare she didn't have. She thought of her mother's grave back in Missouri, the one she'd had to leave without a stone because there hadn't been money enough for that either. She thought of 3 years of swallowing her pride, because pride didn't put bread on a table, and she thought with sudden and startling clarity that she was tired, so tired of being a woman other people talked about instead of a woman other people talked to. "Why would you do this?" she said slowly, "for a stranger who arrived on a train an hour ago?" Cole considered the question like it deserved consideration rather than answering it quick and easy, the way most men would have just to close the conversation and move on. "Because nobody ought to be left standing on a platform with nowhere to go," he said finally. "My mother was left somewhere once. I was young. I remember what it does to a person being left like that with the whole town watching. I swore I wouldn't stand by and let it happen to somebody else if I could help it. That's the whole reason. Ain't no more to it than that." There was something in the way he said it, flat, unadorned, no performance in it at all, that told Clara he wasn't lying. Men who lied about their reasons usually dressed them up prettier than that. "And if I say no, then I'll walk you to the boarding house myself and pay for a week's room so you've got time to write your people and figure your next move. You won't be left out here alone either way. That much I can promise you plain." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Really looked the way she hadn't let herself look at anyone in longer than she could remember, because looking too closely at people usually ended in disappointment. She saw a man who did not smile easily and did not lie easily either. She saw the kind of stillness in him that she associated from her father with men who had buried something and built a wall around the burying so it wouldn't get out again. She saw, too, a kind of loneliness so old it had stopped registering as pain, and had just become the shape of him the way a tree grows crooked around a wound and calls the crooked shape normal. She did not see a man trying to trick her. 6 months, she said. 6 months, Cole agreed. Fair wages, your own room. You walk away anytime you like, no questions, no debt owed. Clara looked down at her suitcases. 2 suitcases and a small purse of coins too thin to matter, and a wedding that had ended before it began. She thought about the women by the ticket window, already composing the story they'd tell over supper tonight. The mail-order bride who got left standing. Poor thing. What did she expect? Traveling all that way to marry a man she'd never met. She thought about walking back onto that train with nothing, going home to nothing, because there was no home left to go home to. All right, she said. I accept. Something in Cole Harrison's shoulders eased just slightly. Not relief exactly, but the settling of a man who'd been braced for a harder conversation than the one he'd gotten. All right, he said. Wagons this way. He reached for her suitcases before she could protest, lifting both as though they weighed nothing at all, and Clara found herself hurrying to keep pace with his long stride across the platform. As they passed the cluster of women by the ticket window, one of them, older, sharp-faced, dressed in a bonnet trimmed with more ribbon than the town likely called for, stepped half a pace forward as if she meant to say something directly to Clara's face. Cole stopped. He didn't say a word. He simply turned, set the suitcases down, and looked at the woman with an expression so calm and so immovable that she took a step back without seeming to realize she'd done it. "Morning, Mrs. Pruitt," he said evenly. "Mr. Harrison." The woman's chin lifted, but her eyes had gone uncertain. "I was only going to say it's a shame is all. About the Carter boy." "Was you," Cole said. "It wasn't a question, and it wasn't friendly either. Miss Whitmore's had a long journey and a longer morning. I expect she'd appreciate not having it made longer still." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth opened, then closed. Whatever she had intended to say, she apparently thought better of it under the weight of Cole Harrison's stare. She gave a stiff little nod and turned back to her companions, and Clara heard the whispering resume behind them quieter, now more careful. Cole picked the suitcases back up and kept walking as though nothing had happened at all. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said once they were out of earshot. "Didn't have to," Cole agreed. "Wanted to." "Why?" He glanced sideways at her, and for just a moment, something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing again. "Same reason as before, Miss Whitmore. Nobody ought to be talked about like they ain't standing right there." They reached the wagon, a plain, sturdy thing, well-kept, the kind of wagon that told her more about the man than his words had. Everything about it was practical. Nothing about it was for show. He set her suitcases in the back with the same easy care he'd shown lifting them, then extended a hand to help her up onto the bench seat. Clara hesitated only a moment before taking it. His hand was rough, calloused, warm, despite the cold morning, and it closed around hers with a steadiness that felt absurdly like the first solid ground she'd stood on all day. She settled onto the bench. Cole climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, rattling away from the station, away from the whispering women, away from the ruins of the life she had planned. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch of road. Clara stared straight ahead at the horizon, at the endless roll of Montana grassland, catching gold in the morning light, and felt something strange happening inside her chest. Grief and relief tangled so close together she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She had lost the future she'd traveled here to claim. She had somehow in the space of 20 minutes been handed a different one, instead offered by a stranger who owed her nothing, and had given her his protection anyway, without asking for a thing in return. She didn't trust it. Not yet. She had learned the hard way that things offered without a price attached usually had one hidden somewhere. But she was tired of running the numbers on every kindness that came her way, looking for the trap in it. Just once she wanted to let herself be helped, without immediately searching for the catch. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, mostly to fill the silence. Mostly because she needed something ordinary to hold on to after a morning that had been anything but. Cole seemed almost grateful for the question, The way a man is grateful to talk about work instead of feelings. Started by my father near on 30 years back. Just him and a handful of cattle and more ambition than sense from what I've been told. Built it up slow. My mother came out from Ohio to marry him when there wasn't hardly a house standing yet, just a cabin and a promise. That sounds like a hard way to start a marriage. Reckon it was. She used to say the land didn't care whether you were ready for it or not. It just kept asking things of you regardless. And the only choice you had was whether you rose to meet it or let it beat you down. Cole's eyes stayed fixed on the road, but something in his voice had gone distant, remembering. She rose to meet it, every single day for near 20 years. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. He didn't offer anything more, and Clara didn't press, sensing the same wall she'd have to learn to work around if she meant to understand this man at all. And your father? Gone 8 years now. Heart gave out in the middle of a branding of all things. Fell right there in the corral dust, and that was that. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a man says something he's had a long time to make peace with, even if the peace was hard won. Ranch has been mine since. Just me, and whatever men I could keep on, and a house that's been slowly forgetting what it's like to have somebody in it who cares about more than just keeping the roof from leaking. Until today, Clara said before she could think better of it. Cole glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Until today, he agreed. They rode on a while longer, the silence between them easier now, less like the careful silence of strangers, and more like the comfortable quiet of two people who had already, in the space of an hour, weathered something together. Clara watched the land roll past grass, gone gold green, with early summer cattle scattered across distant slopes, the mountains standing blue and serrated along the horizon, and found herself, despite everything, drinking in the size of it, the openness of it so different from the cramped, hemmed-in world she'd left behind in Missouri. It's bigger than I imagined, she said. Montana, all of it. Bigger than most folks imagine till they see it. Cole agreed. Takes some getting used to. Sky like that can feel like freedom, or it can feel like being lost depending on the day. And which does it feel like to you? Cole considered the question a long moment before answering. The way she was coming to understand was simply how he answered most things. Not quick, not careless, but weighed and turned over first, like a man checking a fence line before trusting his weight to it. Used to feel like freedom, he said finally. Lately, it's felt more like being lost. Didn't expect that to change on account of a train arriving a little different than planned, but I got a feeling it might. Clara didn't answer that. She wasn't sure yet what there was to say to a man who spoke so plainly about things most men buried under jokes or silence. She only knew that something about the honesty of it settled somewhere warm in her chest, alongside the grief and the humiliation and the exhaustion of the day, and did not feel entirely unwelcome there. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally. "Cole," he said, "Mr. Harrison was my father. Never did care for hearing it aimed at me." "Cole, then." She turned to look at him. "I want you to know I'm not a woman who needs saving. Whatever you might think watching me stand on that platform, I've kept myself and my mother alive through worse than a broken engagement. I know how to work." "Didn't figure you for helpless," Cole said, eyes still on the road. "Woman who crosses 4 states alone to build a new life ain't helpless. She's just had a run of bad luck this morning is all." Clara studied his profile, the set jaw, the weathered lines at the corner of his eye, the stillness of a man who'd learned long ago not to waste words on things that didn't need saying. She thought of Nathaniel Carter's letters, careful and polished, and she now understood entirely hollow underneath. She thought of how easily he had let his family talk him out of a promise, how easily he had sent another man to do the work of breaking her heart because he hadn't the spine to do it himself. Cole Harrison had met her with the truth, however hard delivered it himself, and stood between her and a town's cruelty within the space of a single hour. She did not know yet what to make of that. But she found somewhere beneath the ache of the morning's humiliation a small and stubborn seed of curiosity taking root about the ranch waiting ahead of them, about the men who worked it, and about the quiet, careful stranger sitting beside her, driving her toward a future neither of them had planned on. The road wound on through open country fence lines and grazing cattle, giving way mile by mile to a wide valley cut through with a silver ribbon of river. Clara watched it pass in silence, arms wrapped tight around herself against the wind, and tried not to think too hard about what waited at the end of the road. Tried not to hope. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing to carry too openly. It got noticed. It got taken. "There it is," Cole said, eventually nodding ahead. Clara followed his gaze and saw rising up out of the valley floor a sprawling ranch house flanked by barns and corrals, smoke curling thin from one chimney, the whole place bearing the unmistakable look of somewhere that had once been cared for with great attention and had more recently been merely maintained. Not neglected, she could see even from a distance that the fences were sound, the barns solid but tired. Undertended, like a house holding its breath waiting for someone to come back and fill it up again. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It was," Cole said, and something in his voice made her glance at him again. "Working on getting it back there." They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and as the wagon rolled into the yard, two men emerged from the barn to watch its approach. One young, lanky, sandy-haired, wiping his hands on a rag, with open curiosity written across his face. The other, older, gray at the temples, arms crossed, watching with the guarded patience of a man who had seen a great many things come and go and reserved judgment until he'd seen them prove themselves. "That's Eli," Cole said quietly, nodding at the younger one, "and that's Samuel. Good men, both of them. Might take them a spell to warm up. Don't take it personal if they're slow to it." "I understand," Clara said. "I imagine a strange woman showing up in a wagon isn't an everyday occurrence out here." "No, ma'am," Cole said, and this time the ghost of a smile stayed a beat longer before it disappeared. "Can't say that it is." He brought the wagon to a stop in the yard, set the brake, and climbed down before circling around to help her from the bench. Clara took his offered hand again, steadier this time, and stepped down into the dust of a yard that did not yet feel like anything to her, not home, not safety, not even certainty. Just a place. A beginning, uncertain and unearned, standing where an ending should have been. Eli approached first, tugging his hat brim in an awkward little bow. "Ma'am," he said, "didn't know we were expecting company." "Neither did I this morning," Clara said, and something in her tone, dry, self-aware, unwilling to pretend the situation wasn't strange, startled a short laugh out of the boy before he caught himself and cleared his throat. Samuel said nothing at all. He simply watched, arms still crossed, his eyes moving from Clara to Cole and back again, weighing something Clara couldn't read. "Miss Whitmore's going to be running the house a spell," Cole said, addressing them both plainly, no explanation offered beyond that, no excuse made. "Same wages structure as before. I expect you'll both treat her with the same respect you'd show anybody working this land." "Yes, sir," Eli said quickly. Samuel's gaze lingered a moment longer on Clara before he gave a single short nod. Not warmth, not yet, but not hostility either. An acknowledgement. A reservation of judgment that felt somehow more honest than false friendliness would have. "Ma'am," he said simply, and turned back toward the barn. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He'll come around," Cole said quietly, watching Samuel go. "He's lost people before, slow to let new ones matter to him. Ain't about you." "I didn't take it as about me," Clara said, though in truth some small, tender, exhausted part of her had. Cole studied her for a moment, really studied her, the way he had on the platform, as though trying to read something written in a language he was only part-way fluent in, and then he picked up her suitcases again and started toward the house. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you where you'll be staying. Kitchen needs looking at before supper. Fair warning, the accounts are worse than the kitchen. I never was much good with a ledger." Clara followed him across the yard, her boots sinking slightly into ground, still soft from a recent rain, and looked up at the house rising ahead of her weathered wood, a wide porch, windows that needed washing, a door hanging very faintly crooked on one hinge. It was nothing like the home Nathaniel Carter's letters had described. It was nothing like anything she had pictured for herself on any of the nights she had lain awake in Missouri, imagining what her life might look like on the far side of all this hardship. But it was standing. It was solid. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her. Really looked not through her, not around her, not past her toward the money, or the shame, or the pity she represented, and offered her something honest instead of something pretty. She did not know yet what this house would come to mean to her. She did not know that the quiet, careful man walking ahead of her carrying her suitcases like they weighed nothing would come to matter more than any promise Nathaniel Carter's letters had ever made. She only knew standing in that yard with the Montana wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face that she had been given a door where she'd expected only a locked one, and that whatever waited for her on the other side of it, she intended to walk through it with her chin held high. "Miss Whitmore." Cole had stopped at the porch steps looking back at her waiting. Clara realized she'd paused, lost in thought, still standing at the edge of the yard. "Coming," she said, and climbed the steps behind him, and did not look back at the road that had brought her here. Inside the house smelled of dust and cold ash, and the particular staleness of rooms that had gone too long without a woman's hand in them. Clara stood in the front hall a moment, taking in the crooked picture frames, the layer of grime along the windowsills, the general air of a place that had simply stopped being tended to, rather than one that had been abandoned outright. There was good bones under the neglect. She could see that immediately. Whoever had built this house, and whoever had once kept it, had loved it. "It ain't much to look at right now," Cole said, setting her suitcases down at the foot of the stairs, something almost apologetic in his voice, though he didn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. "It has good bones," Clara said, echoing her own thought aloud, and saw something shift in Cole's expression. Surprise, maybe? Or the first flicker of something warmer than the careful courtesy he'd shown her all morning. "That's what my mother used to say," he said quietly, "about most everything." Clara didn't ask about his mother. She sensed in the sudden stillness that followed his own words that he hadn't meant to say that much, and that pressing on it now would only make him retreat further behind the wall she'd noticed in him back at the station. Instead, she looked around the hall, already cataloging in her mind everything that would need doing: the windows, the floors, the layer of dust, thick enough to write in the smell of a kitchen that clearly hadn't seen a proper meal cooked in it for longer than was good for the men living here. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked. Something in Cole's shoulders eased at the practical question, as though he were grateful to be handed a task instead of a feeling. "This way," he said, and led her down the hall. The kitchen, when they reached it, was worse than the front room. A stack of unwashed dishes leaning precariously in the basin, a stove crusted with old grease shelves, half empty and disorganized. A ledger book shoved into a corner of the counter with papers spilling out of it like it had been abandoned mid-thought and never returned to. Clara looked at all of it, and instead of despair felt something unexpected rise up in her chest. Purpose. A problem she knew exactly how to solve laid out in front of her, plain and solvable, and entirely within her power to fix. "Well," she said, setting her hands on her hips, surveying the wreckage of the room like a general surveying a battlefield she intended to win. "I suppose we'd best get started." Cole, standing in the doorway, watched her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between relief and disbelief, as though he hadn't quite let himself believe until that moment that the woman he'd found weeping proud on a train platform that morning might actually be able to save this house the way she seemed determined to. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't rightly know how to thank you for staying." Clara glanced back at him, already rolling up her sleeves, already reaching for the nearest dish towel, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years learning that self-pity didn't scrub a single pot clean. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Harrison," she said. "You haven't seen what I charge for 6 months of my cooking." For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Cole Harrison laughed a short surprise sound, rusty from disuse, as though the muscles required for it hadn't been exercised in a long while. And Clara, scrubbing grease from a stove that hadn't asked to be saved any more than she had felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. Some small and cautious hope, daring to lift its head for the first time since the train had pulled into Red Hollow that morning. By the time the sun dropped low over the ridge, the kitchen was unrecognizable. Dishes stood clean and stacked. The stove gleamed where grease had crusted an hour before. Clara had found flour salt pork and a jar of preserved beans buried behind a shelf of forgotten tins, and by the time Samuel and Eli came stomping in from the barn, wiping their boots without much conviction, on a mat that hadn't been used for that purpose in longer than either of them could recall. There was a pot of beans and biscuits simmering on the stove, and a table that had been scrubbed and set for the first time in longer than anyone in that house cared to admit. Eli stopped dead in the doorway and stared like he'd walked into the wrong house. "Lord," he said, "is that biscuit I smell?" "It is," Clara said, not looking up from the pot. "Sit down before it gets cold. I don't cook a thing twice in one evening on principle." Eli sat so fast the chair legs screeched against the floor. Samuel lingered a moment longer in the doorway, arms still faintly crossed, watching the scene with the same careful reserve he'd shown in the yard. But Clara noticed when she set his plate down in front of him that his eyes lingered on the food a beat longer than pride wanted to admit. "Ain't had a hot supper at this table since November," he said, mostly to himself. "Well, you'll have one tonight," Clara said, "and tomorrow, provided nobody insults my biscuits between now and then." Eli laughed around a mouthful before he could stop himself, and even Samuel's mouth twitched the ghost of something almost like a smile threatening the corner of his weathered face before he smothered it and reached for his fork instead. Cole took the seat at the head of the table, watching the exchange with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Something quiet, something careful. The look of a man watching a room come back to life after a long time standing empty. He didn't say much through supper. He didn't need to. Clara found herself carrying the conversation instead, asking Eli about the horses, asking Samuel how long he'd worked the ranch, and drawing out of both men, bit by careful bit, the kind of easy talk that a table hadn't heard in that house for the better part of a year. "Ranch used to be different," Eli offered at one point, glancing sideways at Cole, as though checking whether he'd overstepped by saying so. "Before, livelier." "Before what?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. The table went quiet. Cole set his fork down slow and deliberate, and Clara understood immediately she'd stepped somewhere she hadn't been invited. "Before my mother passed," Cole said finally evenly, though something in his voice had gone careful in a way it hadn't been all day. "House was hers mostly. She had a way of keeping it that I never could match." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "I didn't mean to pry." "You didn't," Cole said. "It's a fair question. Been a long while since anybody's asked it plain instead of tiptoeing around it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Samuel of all people cleared his throat and said gruff but not unkind, "House felt more like this tonight than it has in a long while, ma'am, just so you know it." It was Clara understood the closest thing to a welcome she was going to get from him, and she found it meant more to her than a warmer one might have. Supper finished quiet and easy. After that, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, and when Eli and Samuel finally pushed back from the table and headed out toward the bunkhouse, thanking her twice over for the meal, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen with Cole, the lamp burning low between them, the dishes waiting to be cleared. "You didn't have to do all this tonight," Cole said, gesturing at the transformed kitchen, the empty pot the table wiped clean. "Could have rested. Long day, what with everything." "I don't rest well when there's a mess in front of me," Clara said. "Never have. My mother used to say I'd scrub a floor at midnight if it needed it and let the sleeping wait." "Sounds like a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know how," Clara said, and something in the honesty of it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Cole studied her a moment in the lamplight, and Clara let him too tired suddenly to keep her guard raised quite as high as she had all day. "I meant what I said this morning," he said finally. "Nobody ought to be left standing on a platform with nowhere to go. But I'll say this too, now that I've seen what you did with this kitchen in one afternoon, this ranch is lucky Nathaniel Carter's a coward. I don't say that lightly." Clara felt something warm rise in her chest, unfamiliar, and a little frightening in its warmth. "That's a strange thing to thank a man for being." "Didn't say I was thanking him," Cole said. "Just stating a fact." He excused himself not long after showing her up to a small room at the end of the hall. Clean linens, a narrow bed. A lock on the door just as he'd promised on the platform, and left her there with a low, "Good night, Miss Whitmore," that lingered in the hallway air after his boots had already faded down the stairs. Clara sat on the edge of the bed a long while after he'd gone, listening to the unfamiliar creak of an unfamiliar house settling around her, and did not cry, though she thought she might have earned the right to. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, and let the day settle over her, the way dust settles after a long ride, slow and heavy and impossible to outrun. Downstairs in the small room off the kitchen he'd used as an office since his father's passing, Cole Harrison sat a long while at his desk without lighting the lamp, staring at nothing in particular, turning the day over in his mind, the way he turned over a horse's hoof before deciding whether it needed shoeing. He had gone to that station expecting to deliver bad news and walk away with his conscience clear. He had not expected to come home with a woman who scrubbed a stove like she was settling a score with it, who looked a town gossip square in the eye without flinching, who had lost everything twice in one day. First a fiancé who'd never existed except on paper, then briefly any clear notion of what came next, and had still found the steel in her to say, "All right, I accept," rather than curling up under the weight of it, the way plenty of people, man or woman, might have. He thought of his mother, the way this house had sounded when she was still in it. Voices at the table, a fire that never quite went out. The particular warmth of a home that had people in it who wanted to be there. He had told himself for 2 years that the quiet since then was just the natural order of things, a ranch settling into. What ranches settled into once the women who built their hearts were gone from them. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that quiet had broken and the house had sounded for one supper almost like it used to. He did not let himself examine too closely what that might mean. 6 months, he reminded himself. An arrangement, a kindness extended to a stranger who'd needed one nothing more complicated than that. But some stubborn quiet part of him, the part that had gone still and careful since the last time he'd let himself hope for anything beyond the next season's cattle prices, noted all the same that he was already looking forward to breakfast. She did not know yet what this ranch would ask of her, or what it would give back in return. She did not know that the town whispering behind gloved hands would not be finished with her yet, that a man named Victor Blackwell was already circling the valley with designs on the water running through Cole Harrison's land, or that the quiet cowboy scrubbing grease alongside her because he had within minutes rolled up his own sleeves and joined her, rather than standing by and watching her work alone, carried a grief of his own, buried so deep he'd nearly convinced himself it wasn't there anymore. All she knew, standing in that ruined kitchen with the afternoon light slanting gold through a window that badly needed washing, was that the life she'd traveled 2,000 miles to find had not waited for her at the end of that train line after all. It had been waiting instead in the last place she'd thought to look. Morning came to the ranch house before Cole did. Clara was already awake when the first gray light hit her window, already dressed, already downstairs, with her sleeves rolled and a fire crackling in the stove, before the rooster had finished its first complaint. She had lain awake a long while the night before, turning the day over in her mind, and had woken with a single clear thought sitting in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She was not going to let this house go back to what it had been. She found the ledger where Cole had shoved it the day before, papers spilling loose from its spine, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and began sorting through 2 years of neglect, one page at a time. What she found made her set the cup down hard enough to slosh coffee over the rim. "Mr. Harrison," she called the moment she heard his boots on the stairs. "Cole." He appeared in the doorway, hat already in hand, clearly halfway out to the barn, before her voice stopped him. "Ma'am, you are being robbed." That got his attention. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and looked over her shoulder at the ledger, at the column of figures she'd circled in pencil, and his jaw went tight in a way she was already starting to recognize. "Feed suppliers charging you near double what the going rate is in the county," Clara said, tapping the page. "Has been for the better part of a year from what I can tell. And this entry here, lumber for the south fence, paid twice in the same month, once to Hargrove, and once to a name I don't recognize at all." "Let me see that." She turned the ledger toward him. Cole stared at the numbers a long moment, and Clara watched something harden behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like a suspicion finally confirmed. "Blackwell's cousin runs the feed store," he said quietly. "Blackwell. Victor Blackwell, cattleman 2 valleys over. Been trying to buy me out since my father passed, and when I wouldn't sell, he started finding other ways to make my life harder." Cole set the ledger down slow, like it might bite him if he moved too fast. Didn't figure he'd gotten his hooks that deep into my own accounts. Well, he has, Clara said, and I intend to fix it. Cole looked at her, something between alarm and admiration crossing his face. Ma'am, this ain't exactly housekeeping. No, Clara agreed. It's arithmetic, and arithmetic is the one thing in this world that's never once lied to me. By the end of that first week, the kitchen gleamed. The pantry stood stocked and organized by a system only Clara fully understood, and the feed supplier had received a very polite, very precise letter itemizing 11 months of overcharges with a request for either an explanation or a refund by month's end. Eli found the whole business hilarious. Samuel found it grudgingly impressive. Cole found himself more than once standing in a doorway, watching Clara work with an expression he didn't examine too closely. She's gonna run this whole outfit better than you do inside a month, Eli said one evening, grinning around a mouthful of stew, and Cole didn't argue the point, because he suspected the boy was right. The incident with the gray mare happened on the 9th day, and it was the thing that finally settled Samuel's lingering doubt about her once and for all. Claire had been crossing the yard with an armful of linens when the animal spooked some noise from the smithy, a dropped tool. Nobody ever did agree on the cause, and came thundering loose from the corral with its lead rope, whipping dangerous behind it, straight toward the well, where Eli stood with his back turned, oblivious, hauling up a bucket. Eli! Clara dropped the linens and ran. She didn't think. There wasn't time to think. She closed the gap between herself and the boy in a handful of strides, and shoved him hard sideways out of the mare's path, and felt the animal's shoulder clip her own as it thundered past, spinning her half around and dropping her hard onto the packed dirt of the yard. For a moment, the whole world was just dust and the ringing in her ears. Clara! Cole was there before she'd even caught her breath, dropping to his knees beside her hands, hovering like he didn't know where it was safe to touch. Clara, look at me. Are you hurt? Talk to me. I'm fine, she managed, though her shoulders screamed otherwise and her palms were scraped raw from the fall. Eli is Eli. I'm all right, ma'am. Eli's voice cracked with the particular panic of a young man who'd just watched someone throw themselves between him and a half-ton of frightened horseflesh. You, Miss Whitmore, you could have been trampled. Wasn't going to let it be you, Clara said, and tried to sit up and winced hard enough that Cole's hand came to her back, immediately steadying careful. Slow, he said. Slow. Let me look at you before you go proving anything else today. Samuel had the mare caught and calmed within the minute, murmuring low in the animal's ear. But his eyes kept cutting back across the yard to where Cole knelt beside Clara in the dirt, checking her over with hands that shook faintly despite his outward calm. Shoulder's gonna bruise, Cole said finally, some of the fear in his voice giving way to something gruffer, angrier, the particular anger of a man who'd been badly frightened and needed somewhere to put it. Scraped your hands up good, too. What in God's name were you thinking running at a spooked horse like that? I was thinking Eli was about to get trampled, Clara said, and that seemed like a worse outcome than a bruised shoulder. Could have been you trampled instead. Could have been, Clara agreed, but it wasn't, and he's standing there in one piece, so I'd call that a fair trade. Cole stared at her a long moment. Something fierce and helpless tangled together behind his eyes. And then very carefully, as though he weren't quite sure he had the right to do it, he reached out and brushed a streak of dirt from her cheek with his thumb. You scared 10 years off me just now, he said quietly. I'll try to do my scaring more conveniently next time, Clara said, and the shakiness of her own attempted joke betrayed just how frightened she'd been too, underneath the instinct that had sent her running. Samuel, leading the calmed mare back toward the corral, caught Cole's eye over Clara's head, and gave a single slow nod, the same gesture he'd given on her first day in the yard. Except this time, it carried none of the reservation it had carried then. This time, it looked unmistakably like respect. Ma'am, he said, pausing beside her before he led the horse away. Ain't many folks would have moved that fast for somebody else's mistake. Eli's a fool for standing with his back to an open corral, but that's beside the point tonight. Obliged to you." "He's family," Clara said simply, and did not seem to notice in the moment how naturally the word had come to her, though Cole noticed it plainly, and something in his chest went warm and unsteady at the sound of it. It wasn't only the Ledgers either. Clara had a way of noticing things nobody else thought to notice, that Eli flinched whenever anyone raised a voice too sharp and gentled her own tone around him without ever remarking on why. That Samuel ate alone at the end of the table out of habit rather than preference, and began without quite realizing it, drifting his chair a little closer to the rest of them. Each night she set a plate down in front of him, with a word or two of easy conversation attached. The bunkhouse, which had smelled of stale smoke and worse cooking, for 2 years running started smelling instead like bread. The ranch hands who had drifted through their days like men serving out a sentence started lingering at supper instead of bolting their food and disappearing. "Never seen the men laugh this much," Samuel admitted to Cole one night out by the corral, both of them leaning on the fence rail, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. "Not since your mother's time." "I noticed," Cole said. "You noticing anything else?" Cole shot him a look. Samuel infuriatingly just raised an eyebrow and said nothing more, letting the silence do the accusing for him. Cole didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either, and that from a man as careful with his words as Cole Harrison was answer enough for anybody paying attention. The trouble started on a Tuesday. Clara had walked into town for supplies flour thread, a length of oilcloth for the pantry shelves, and had just stepped out of the general store when she nearly collided with a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a coat too fine for a working ranch, and boots too clean for a man who claimed cattle for his living. He looked at her the way a buyer looks at livestock, assessing unhurried, and something in the look made Clara's spine go straight before he'd said a single word. "You'd be Harrison's new housekeeper," he said, not a question. "I'd be Miss Whitmore," Clara said evenly. "And you are Victor Blackwell." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy, the kind that felt more like mockery than manners. "I own the Circle B other side of the valley. Heard all about you, Miss Whitmore. Whole town's heard about you. I can't imagine what there is to hear." "Can't you?" Blackwell smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. Mail order bride left standing on the platform taken in by the neighboring rancher inside the hour. Quite a story. Quite a fortunate turn of events for a woman with nothing left to her name. Clara felt heat rise in her chest, sharp and immediate. "I work for my keep, Mr. Blackwell, same as any honest person." "I'm sure you do." His eyes flicked deliberate and unhurried over her plain traveling dress, and Clara understood with sudden clarity that this man was not simply being rude. He was testing her the way a man tests a fence for weak points before deciding where to push. Cole Harrison's always been soft-hearted. His father was the same way. Soft hearts make for easy targets in my experience. Is that a warning? It's an observation. Blackwell's smile widened thin as a blade. You have a fine day, Miss Whitmore. Do give Cole my regards. He walked off before she could answer, and Clara stood on the boardwalk a long moment, heart hammering, replaying the exchange, and finding the more she turned it over that it had not felt like an accidental meeting at all. She told Cole about it that evening over supper, watching his face darken with every detail. He came to the store on purpose, Cole said once she'd finished. Man doesn't shop in town, sends men to do it for him. He came to look at you. Why would he care about me? Because he can't get to me straight on, Cole said, jaw tight. Man's been trying to force me off my land for 2 years. Offers, then threats dressed up as offers, then finally just threats. He wants the water rights running through my west pasture. Whole valley depends on that water, and he knows if he controls it, he controls every ranch downstream of it, mine included. He set his fork down, appetite gone. If he can't scare me off my land, maybe he figures he can scare off the people around me instead. Make my life harder any way he can. So this is about the ranch, Clara said slowly. Not about me at all. It's about the ranch, Cole agreed. But that don't mean it won't land on you. Man like Blackwell, he doesn't fight fair, and he doesn't fight quiet. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach, and beneath it something else, a stubborn rising anger that refused to be frightened into silence. "Let him try," she said. Cole looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not quite worry, not quite admiration, something tangled up between the two. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," he said quietly. "That you will." The days that followed fell into a rhythm, neither of them named out loud, though both of them felt it settle over the house like something earned rather than given. Clara rose before dawn and worked until dusk, and somewhere in the space between those two markers, she and Cole had begun finding reasons to linger over coffee before the men woke over the ledger in the evenings, over small repairs around the house that didn't strictly require two sets of hands, but somehow always ended up with two sets of hands doing them anyway. It was during one of those evenings fixing a hinge on the pantry door that had been crooked since before Clara arrived that Cole told her about his mother. "She used to stand right here," he said, nodding at the spot where Clara knelt with a screwdriver, every morning, same time, same window, watching the sun come up over the ridge. Said it was the one part of the day that belonged to her before it belonged to anybody else. "What happened to her?" Cole was quiet a moment, turning a nail between his fingers. "Fever took her the winter I turned 22, he said. "Came on fast. 3 days, and she was gone. My father never was the same man after. Held the ranch together out of stubbornness more than anything else. And when he went down in that corral 6 years later, I think some part of him had already left with her." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it, setting the screwdriver down. "Everybody's sorry," Cole said, not unkindly. "Don't change much. What changes things is what a person does with the sorry once they've got it." He looked at her, something raw and unguarded crossing his face for just a moment before he caught it and pulled it back behind the wall she was coming to recognize as his default shape. "There was a woman before. After my mother passed. I thought, well, doesn't matter what I thought." "It matters," Clara said quietly. "You don't have to tell me, but it matters." Cole exhaled slow, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten the weight of it. Her name was Margaret, schoolteacher's daughter from over in Bozeman. Courted her the better part of a year. Asked her to marry me, and she said yes, and for about 2 months I thought I had my whole life figured clean. He turned the nail over again. Then she came out here to see the ranch proper first time, and I watched her face the whole visit, and I knew before she ever said a word. Wasn't hard living out here that scared her. It was the loneliness of it, the size of the sky. She told me real gentle that she loved me fine, but she couldn't spend her whole life this far from anything, this far from anybody. Broke it off inside the week. "That's not the same as what Nathaniel did," Clara said. "She told you herself. She was honest." "She was," Cole agreed. "Doesn't make the leaving hurt less, just makes it a different kind of hurt." He looked at Clara, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "I told myself after that loneliness was safer than disappointment, easier to plan around. You can't lose what you never let yourself want in the first place." And now, the question hung in the air a long moment longer than Clara had intended it to. "Now," Cole said slowly, "I'm starting to think that was a coward's arithmetic, and I never much liked being a coward at anything else in my life." Neither of them moved. The pantry hinge sat half-fixed between them, forgotten, and Clara felt her heart beating hard enough that she was certain he could hear it in the quiet of the kitchen. It was Eli bursting through the back door, hollering about a downed fence in the north pasture who broke whatever was about to happen between them, and both of them stepped back from the moment so fast, it was as if neither wanted to be caught standing that close to something neither was ready to name. The fence, it turned out, hadn't fallen on its own. Cole rode out at first light with Samuel and found 3 full sections cut clean through with wire snips not broken by weather or worn through by time, but deliberately severed the ends, still sharp and fresh. A dozen head of cattle had wandered through the gap overnight, scattering across open range where wolves and thieves alike could pick them off at leisure. "This weren't an accident," Samuel said, crouched over the cut wire, turning one severed end over in his weathered hand. "No." Cole agreed, voice flat and cold, in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before. When he came back to tell her about it that afternoon, jaw-set hat pushed back off his forehead. It weren't. Blackwell, Clara said. Can't prove it. Man's too careful to leave his own hands dirty, but I know his work when I see it. Cole dropped into a chair at the kitchen table, exhaustion and fury warring plainly across his face. This is just the opening move, Clara. He's testing how far I'll bend before I break. It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of Miss Whitmore, and Clara noticed it even through the worry tightening her chest, filed it away somewhere private and warm, despite everything. Then don't bend, she said. Rebuild the fence. Round up the cattle. Show him it didn't work. That's the easy part, Cole said. The hard part's knowing what he tries next. He didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Clara walked into town again, this time for thread and a length of ribbon Eli had sheepishly asked her to buy for a girl he'd been too shy to court properly, and found the boardwalk outside the general store unusually crowded. Women clustered in 2s and 3s with their heads bent, close voices dropping the moment she came into view. She recognized the pattern immediately. She had lived it once already on a train platform, and she felt the old humiliation rise up fresh and raw before she'd even reached the door. There she is, someone murmured, not quietly enough. Clara kept her chin level and her pace steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a flinch, and stepped inside the store where Mrs. Pruitt stood at the counter, arms crossed, waiting like she'd known Clara would walk through that door eventually. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Pruitt said in a tone dripping with false sweetness. Or should I say Miss Harrison-to-be? Word travels fast in a town this size. I don't know what you mean, Clara said carefully. Don't you? Mrs. Pruitt's eyes gleamed with the particular relish of a woman who'd been waiting to deliver bad news dressed up as gossip. Whole town's talking about how convenient it all worked out for you. Left standing on a platform one morning, moved right into Cole Harrison's house that same afternoon. Some folks are saying you two had it planned from the start. That Nathaniel Carter backing out was no accident at all, that you knew he would, and you knew Cole would be there to catch you when he did. Clara's blood went cold. That's a lie. Is it man like Cole Harrison sitting on the best water rights in the valley, lonely as a man can be since his mother passed? And here you come, educated, clever with numbers, awful good at making yourself indispensable in a house that isn't yours. Mrs. Pruitt's smile sharpened. Mr. Blackwell was saying just yesterday, it's quite the opportunity for a woman with nothing landing in a house like that. Wonder how long before the housekeeping arrangement becomes something a bit more permanent and a bit more profitable. The words hit Clara like a slap. I have never, Clara said, voice shaking with fury. She fought hard to keep leashed, asked Cole Harrison for one single thing beyond honest wages for honest work. Of course you'd say that. Mrs. Pruitt's tone had gone syrupy with false pity, now somehow worse than the sharpness before it. Desperate women always say that, dear. Right up until they don't have to anymore. Clara turned and walked out of that store without buying a single thing, without trusting herself to say another word, and stood on the boardwalk a long moment, with the whole town's eyes on her back, feeling the same cold humiliation she'd felt on that train platform 3 weeks earlier. Except this time, there was no stranger stepping forward to stand between her and the crowd. This time, she was going to have to stand there herself. She rode back to their ranch in silence, and when Cole met her in the yard and saw her face, he knew immediately something had gone wrong. What happened? Clara told him. All of it. Watched his expression darken with every word, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides by the time she finished. That's Blackwell's doing, he said, voice tight and low. Has to be. Mrs. Pruitt's tongue for gossip, but that particular flavor of poison, that's him. It doesn't matter whose doing it is, Clara said. It's already spreading. By tomorrow, the whole valley will believe I planned my own humiliation just to land myself a husband with land. Nobody who knows you will believe that. Plenty of people don't know me, Cole. They only know the story they've decided to tell about me. Her voice cracked just slightly, the first crack she'd allowed to show since the day of the train. I've spent 3 years watching people decide who I am before I open my mouth. I thought coming out here might be different." Cole crossed the yard and stopped in front of her close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "It is different," he said finally, "because this time you ain't standing there alone facing it down. And this time, I ain't just standing beside you out of decency. I mean to stand beside you because I want to." He hesitated like the words cost him something to say out loud. "I should have said this plainer sooner. I don't know exactly when it happened. Somewhere between you scrubbing that stove your first night and you catching Blackwell's cousin robbing me blind somewhere in there, I stopped thinking of you as a woman. I was helping out of decency and started thinking of you as a woman I couldn't picture this ranch without." Clara's breath caught. "Cole, I ain't finished." His voice, roughened, urgent now, like a dam he'd been holding shut for weeks had finally given way. "I know it's fast. I know 6 months was the arrangement, and I know a man oughtn't go changing the terms on a woman who never asked for more than honest work. But I'm done pretending I don't watch for you at breakfast, or that I don't find reasons to be in whatever room you're working in, or that the whole house doesn't feel different better since the day you walked into it. Blackwell can say whatever poison he likes about why you're here. I know why you're here. And more than that, I know I don't want you leaving." For a moment, Clara couldn't speak at all. "You don't have to answer that now," Cole said quickly, some of his earlier certainty faltering under her silence. "I just needed you to hear it plain, especially today, especially with the whole town trying to make your reasons for being here sound ugly. Whatever's between us, it ain't ugly. I need you to know that whatever else you're carrying home with you tonight." "I hear you," Clara said softly once she'd found her voice again. I need time, Cole. Not because I doubt what you're saying, because I've been wrong about a man's promises before, and it cost me everything I had. I understand that." Something in Cole's face gentled, though the fire hadn't left his eyes entirely. "I ain't Nathaniel Carter. I ain't going to send another man to do my talking for me, and I ain't going to let a family's opinion or a town's gossip talk me out of what I know to be true. Take whatever time you need. I'll still be here." It should have felt like enough. For one suspended moment standing in that yard with the evening light going gold around them, it almost did. Then Samuel came riding in hard from the west pasture horse, lathered face grim in a way that stopped both their hearts before he'd said a single word. "Cole." He swung down before the horse had fully stopped chest-heaving. "West Well's fouled. Somebody dumped something in it. Dead animal, looks like maybe worse. Cattle that drank from it this morning are already showing sick." Cole went white. "How many head?" "Counted 11 so far. More might follow." "That's near a third of what's grazing that pasture," Cole said, voice gone hollow with the calculation running behind his eyes. "There's more," Samuel said, and something in his tone made both Cole and Clara go still. "Found this nailed to the well post." He held out a folded scrap of paper. Cole took it with hands that weren't quite steady, unfolded it, read it once, and his jaw went tight as iron. "What does it say?" Clara asked. Cole looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, she understood immediately, but for what was coming. "It says," Cole said slowly, "that this is what happens to ranches that don't know when to sell, and that the next thing poisoned won't be a well." The words hung in the air, heavy as a held breath, and Clara felt the warmth of the last few minutes drain clean out of the evening, replaced by something cold and sharp and entirely new. "He's threatening us," she said. "He's threatening everybody on this ranch," Cole said. "You included. Which means this ain't a fight I can afford to lose, and it ain't one I can afford to fight careful anymore." He folded the note back up slow and deliberate, the way a man folds something he intends to keep as evidence, rather than throw away in anger, and looked out toward the darkening ridge, where somewhere beyond it, Victor Blackwell was no doubt sitting comfortable in his own parlor, confident that fear alone would be enough to finish what intimidation had started. "Samuel!" Cole said, voice steady now, all the earlier tenderness folded away behind something harder, something that reminded Clara for just a moment of the man who'd stood between her and Mrs. Pruitt on the train platform without raising his voice once. "Get the rest of the herd off that pasture tonight. I don't care if we're moving cattle by lantern light. I want every head Blackwell hasn't already poisoned somewhere safe by morning. On it!" Samuel was already swinging back up into the saddle. "And Clara?" Cole turned to her, and whatever softness had been building between them in the yard moments before had hardened now into something fiercer. Something that looked, Clara realized with a jolt, very much like a man readying himself for a fight he intended to win. "I need you to go through every scrap of paper in that office tonight. Every deed, every old survey, every contract my father ever signed. If Blackwell's building toward taking this land by force, there's got to be something in this house that tells us exactly how he means to try. And I mean to find it before he makes his next move." Clara felt her own fear sharpen into something usable, something with an edge to it. "Then we'd better get started," she said, "because I don't intend to let him win either." They walked into the house together side by side, the note still folded in Cole's fist, the last light draining out of the sky behind them, and neither one of them looked back toward the ridge where the trouble was gathering, because both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever Victor Blackwell intended to throw at them next, he was about to discover that Clara Whitmore did not scare as easily as a woman left standing alone on a train platform once might have. She worked through the office by lamplight, while Cole rode out with Samuel and Eli to move the herd, sorting 3 decades of paper into piles on the floor around her deeds. Tax receipts, old letters gone brittle at the folds. Contracts with names she didn't recognize scrawled across the bottom in faded ink. Her eyes burned. Her back ached from bending over boxes that hadn't been opened since Cole's father's time. She kept going anyway, because stopping felt that night like the one thing she couldn't afford to do. Near midnight, she found it. A contract dated 11 years back bearing Victor Blackwell's signature alongside that of a rancher named Thomas Averill. A name Clara didn't know, but one that appeared again, she realized with a jolt, in a newspaper clipping tucked into the same box. Brittle and yellowed, reporting the sale of the Averill Ranch to the Circle B, under what the article delicately called disputed circumstances. She kept digging, found another name, another contract, another newspaper clipping, another ranch swallowed whole by the Circle B, under terms that always seemed to involve a sudden dispute over water rights. A run of unexplained cattle losses, a town somehow already primed with rumors against the seller before the ink on the sale was even dry. It wasn't random. It was a pattern laid out plain across a decade of paper, and Clara sat back on her heels in the lamplight with her heart hammering, understanding all at once that Cole Harrison was not Victor Blackwell's first target. He was simply the one still standing. She was still sitting amid the scattered boxes when she heard the wagon roll into the yard past 2 a.m, and heard Cole's boots on the porch steps a moment later, slow with exhaustion, heavy with a night spent driving frightened cattle across dark pasture by lantern light. "We lost 3 more, he said before she could ask, dropping into the chair across from her, hat tossed on the table, hands still shaking faintly from cold and strain. 14 head total. Vets coming at first light to see what more can be saved. Rest of the herds moved to the east pasture water source. There's Clean Samuel standing watch till dawn, just in case Blackwell tries something else tonight. Cole." Clara pushed the contract and the clipping across the table toward him. "Look at this." He read it once, read it again slower, his face going through something complicated, recognition fury, and beneath it something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man finally seeing the shape of an enemy he'd been fighting blind. "Averill," he said quietly. "I remember hearing that name when I was a boy. Ranch went under sudden, nobody quite knew why. Man moved his family east inside the year." He looked up at Clara, something fierce kindling behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "How many more of these did you find?" 4, all the same pattern. Water dispute, cattle losses. Town gossip turned poisonous almost overnight, and then a sale that always somehow benefited Blackwell most. Clara's voice had gone low and urgent. "He's done this before, Cole. 4 times that I've found so far. This isn't a man testing his luck against you. This is a method. A tested one." "Then it's a method with a paper trail," Cole said slowly. And for the first time all night, something like hope cracked through the exhaustion in his voice. A method leaves witnesses, leaves people who got cheated and never had the proof to say so out loud. People like Thomas Averill, Clara said. People like Thomas Averill. Cole agreed and looked at her with an expression that made her chest go tight and warm despite the hour, despite the exhaustion pulling at both of them. You found this in one night, Clara. One night going through boxes nobody's touched in years. I've owned this ranch 8 years and never once thought to look. You never had a reason to look, Clara said. You were too busy trying to survive whatever he threw at you day to day to step back and see the whole shape of it. Maybe. Cole reached across the table, slow, deliberate, and covered her hand with his rough palm, calloused fingers, warm despite the cold that clung to his coat from hours in the night air. Or maybe I just needed somebody standing beside me who knew how to look. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The lamp guttered low between them, throwing long shadows across the scattered papers, across 4 ruined families' worth of proof that Victor Blackwell was not a man who fought fair and had never once had to, because nobody before now had thought to fight back with anything sharper than fists and fences. We ride out to find Thomas Averill's people, Cole said, finally quiet and certain. First thing soon as the vet's seen to the herd. If there's a paper trail on 4 ranches, there might be 4 families willing to swear to what really happened. That's enough to take to a judge. That's enough to make Blackwell answer for more than just a bad-tempered neighbor. And if he finds out we're looking before we get there, Cole's jaw tightened. Then we'd best move faster than he expects. The vet arrived at dawn, grim-faced, and confirmed what Samuel had already feared. The well water had been fouled deliberately. Some caustic mix designed to sicken slow, rather than kill, fast cruel, and calculated in exactly the way that told Cole this was meant as a warning, rather than a killing blow. 3 more head were lost by noon. The rest, the vet said, stood a fair chance if kept off that pasture and watered clean going forward. Somebody wanted you scared, not ruined, the vet said, packing up his bag, throwing Cole a look heavy with unspoken sympathy. Whoever it was, they're not finished. Man who poisons a well once usually finds a reason to try something worse if the first message don't land. Message landed, Cole said grimly. Just not the way he wanted it to. That afternoon, riding into town for supplies, neither of them could really spare the time for, but both understood they needed as cover for a different errand entirely. Clara and Cole crossed paths with Victor Blackwell outside the bank, and for the first time since the encounter outside the general store, Clara found herself standing close enough to look the man dead in the eye. Mr. Harrison? Blackwell's smile was thin, unhurried, a man entirely certain of his own advantage. Heard you had some trouble out at your place. Sickness in the herd, was it terrible thing losing cattle that way? This country can be awful unforgiving to a ranch that's understaffed, underfunded, overextended. His eyes slid to Clara, cold and assessing. Must be a comfort having Miss Whitmore there to help you manage the books at least. Though I hear even her talents have limits. Funny thing about limits? Cole said, voice even dangerous in its calm. Man like you keeps testing mine. Might find out where they actually sit one of these days, and I don't expect you'll care for the answer. Blackwell's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still. Is that a threat, Mr. Harrison? It's an observation, Cole said, echoing deliberately the exact words Blackwell had used on Clara weeks before. Same as the one you gave Miss Whitmore outside the store. Funny how those things sound different depending on which end of them you're standing on. For just a moment, brief but unmistakable, something flickered across Victor Blackwell's face. Not fear exactly, but the first thin crack of a man realizing his opponent had started fighting back with information rather than fists, and had no idea yet how much of it. You have a fine day, Mr. Harrison, Blackwell said finally, tipping his hat with the same mocking courtesy he'd shown Clara weeks before, and walked off down the boardwalk without looking back. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He doesn't know what we found, she said quietly once Blackwell was out of earshot. No, Cole agreed. But he's about to start wondering. Man like that arrogance is his weakness, same as it's his weapon. He's used to people being too scared or too beaten down to look past what he wants them to see. He looked at Clara, something fierce and certain settling into his expression. We're going to make sure he never sees us coming until it's too late to matter. They rode out of town that evening with flour and thread bought as cover, and a folded scrap of paper tucked deep in Cole's coat pocket, bearing the address of Thomas Averil's cousin, still living 2 counties over the first thread in what both of them now understood might be the only rope strong enough to pull Victor Blackwell's whole scheme down around him. They didn't speak much on the ride home. The road unwound behind them in the last honeyed light of evening, and Clara found herself more than once stealing glances at the set of Cole's jaw, the careful way he held the reins, the exhaustion he was doing a poor job of hiding beneath the same steady calm he'd worn since the morning he'd met her train. "You're frightened," she said finally when the silence had stretched long enough that she couldn't hold the observation back any longer. Cole didn't deny it. "Man'd be a fool not to be. Blackwell's already poisoned a well and cut fence line. Averil's people are 2 counties off, and there's no telling what Blackwell does next if he so much as suspects we're closing in on him, before we've got enough proof to make it matter." "I'm frightened too," Clara admitted. "Not of losing the ranch, of losing this, all of it, the kitchen, the men at the table, the mornings." She stopped herself, embarrassed at how much had spilled out unguarded, and looked down at her hands instead of at him. 3 weeks ago I had nothing left to lose, and somehow that made everything simpler. Now I have all of this, and I find I'm terrified of what it would cost to have it taken away. Cole brought the wagon to a slow stop at the crest of the ridge overlooking the valley, where the last light was catching gold and copper across the grass, and turned to look at her fully. "Then we don't let it get taken away," he said, quiet and certain. "Whatever it costs." "That's an easy thing to say." "It ain't easy," Cole said. "It's just true. Same as this is true." He reached over, slow, deliberate, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. "I told you back at the house I stopped thinking of you as somebody I was just helping out of decency. I want you to hear the rest of it too. Whatever comes of Blackwell, whatever comes of any of this. I don't want you gone in 3 months when the arrangement's up. I don't want you gone ever if I've got any say in the matter." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could see it in the pulse at her throat. "Cole, I know it's fast," he said again, softer this time. "I know you said you needed time, and I meant what I said. I'll give you every bit of it you ask for. I just needed you to know, sitting up here where nobody but the sky's listening, that whatever I feel for you ain't about to change because a man like Blackwell decides to make things hard for us. If anything, it's only made me surer." He leaned in slow enough that she could have stopped him, slow enough that it was very clearly a question rather than a claim, and Clara found she did not want to stop him at all, found herself leaning in to close the last of the distance herself. A gunshot cracked somewhere in the far distance, sharp and unmistakable, rolling across the valley from the direction of the east pasture where the herd had been moved for safekeeping only hours before. Both of them went rigid. "That's Samuel's signal," Cole said, already snapping the reins hard, wagon lurching forward before Clara had fully caught her breath. 3 shots means trouble at the herd. 1 means it's already found us." "That was 1, Clara said, gripping the bench seat as the wagon picked up speed, dread pooling cold and sudden in her stomach. "I know," Cole said. Grimly, eyes fixed hard on the darkening road ahead. Every trace of the tenderness from a moment before burned away by something harder, more urgent, more afraid. "Which means whatever Blackwell's got planned next, he ain't waiting for morning to try it." The wagon thundered down the ridge road into gathering dark, and Clara held on tight, heart still racing from the moment on the hilltop, and now twined through it, a fear sharp enough to leave no room for anything else at all. Somewhere ahead of them, past the black shapes of grazing cattle and the thin silver line of the river, a second shot cracked out across the valley, closer this time, and then a third, and Cole's whole body went taut beside her as he urged the horses faster still, the wagon wheels striking sparks off stone in the near dark. 3 shots, Clara said, breathless, gripping the bench rail hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "You said 3 shots meant trouble at the herd," I know what I said. Cole's voice had gone low and hard, every softness burned clean out of it. Means Samuel's got more than he can handle alone out there. Means whatever Blackwell sent tonight, it wasn't just words on a scrap of paper nailed to a well post. He didn't say the rest of what he was thinking. He didn't have to. Clara could see it plain enough in the white-knuckled grip he had on the reins, in the way his eyes never once left the dark road ahead, that after a note threatening something worse than a poisoned well after 14 head of cattle already lost after weeks of careful cowardly cruelty finally boiling over into gunfire in the dark. Victor Blackwell had stopped testing how far Cole Harrison would bend. He had decided instead to find out exactly what it would take to break him. Cole looked at her a long moment in the fading light. This woman who'd arrived on his ranch 3 weeks earlier, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken engagement, who now rode beside him, plotting the downfall of the most powerful man in the valley, like she'd been born to it. And something in his chest turned over fierce, and certain a feeling he no longer had any interest in pretending wasn't exactly what it felt like. She had learned in 3 weeks on this ranch exactly what she was capable of when she had something worth fighting for. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train with nothing left but her pride, she understood with a clarity that steadied her hands, even as her heart still raced that she did. The wagon crested the last rise above the east pasture, and Cole hauled back on the reins so hard the horses screamed in protest, because what lay below them in the dying light was not a stampede. It was 3 riders strangers, driving a dozen head of Cole's cattle hard toward a break in the tree line, and Samuel on foot, between them and the herd rifle raised alone. "Get down," Cole said, already vaulting off the wagon bench before it had fully stopped rifle coming up out of the footwell in the same motion. "Clara, get down and stay low behind the wheel, do you hear me?" She heard him. She did not obey him, not entirely. She scrambled down and pressed herself against the wagon's side, same as he'd asked. But she kept her eyes above the wheel rim, kept watching, because she found she could not make herself look away, while Cole ran toward gunfire. "Harrison, land!" Cole's voice boomed out across the pasture, hard as a gunshot itself. "Turn those cattle loose and ride, or I put you down where you sit." One of the riders wheeled his horse toward Cole instead of answering rifle swinging up, and Clara's whole body went cold and electric at once, every nerve screaming at her to do something, anything, and finding nothing to do but watch. The shot came from Samuel, not Cole. Fast, precise, aimed low, and deliberate, not to kill Clara understood later, but to end the argument before it could become one, and the rider's horse screamed and reared as the bullet caught the ground beside its hooves, close enough to end any appetite for a gunfight the man might have been building toward. "Go!" The second rider was already shouting, hauling his own horse around hard. "Go, go, this ain't worth it!" The 3 of them broke and ran cattle forgotten, spurring their horses back toward the tree line at a dead gallop, and Cole fired twice more into the air above their heads, a warning. Not a killing shot, though his jaw was set hard enough that Clara understood he'd have made it a killing shot without a second thought if they'd turned back around. Then, as fast as it had started, it was over. The drumming hoofbeats faded into the dark tree line and were gone, and the pasture went quiet, except for the unsettled lowing of cattle and the ragged sound of 3 people trying to catch their breath. "Samuel!" Cole was already running toward him. "You hit." "No." Samuel lowered the rifle hands, shaking now that the danger had passed. The way hands always shake once there's finally room for the fear to catch up to the body. "Winged one of my own shots wrong and about took my own boot off, but no, I ain't hit." What happened? Clara had abandoned the wagon entirely, now running across the grass toward them, heart still hammering. "Samuel, what happened? Heard them cutting through the tree line right after dark," Samuel said, still catching his breath. 3 of them. "Didn't recognize the faces, but I recognized the work. Same as the fence, same as the well. Man doesn't send strangers to do a job like that unless he's paying well enough that strangers don't ask questions." "Blackwell." Cole said, the name coming out of him like a curse. "Didn't see him himself," Samuel said. "But there's this." He held out something small metallic, caught the last of the light. A belt buckle, ornate engraved with a stylized letter B, circled by a ring of longhorn horns. Cole took it, turned it over once, and something in his face went very still. "That's a Circle B buckle," he said quietly. "Every hand on Blackwell's payroll wears one. Man's vain enough to brand his own riders like cattle." "One of them lost it in the scuffle?" Clara asked. "One of them's about to be missing a piece of proof he can't explain away," Cole said. And for the first time all evening, something like grim satisfaction cut through the fear on his face. "This on top of what you found in the office tonight, that's 2 threads now, Clara. 2 threads pointing straight back to the same man. It should have felt like a victory." For one breath standing in that dark pasture with the cattle finally settling, and Samuel alive and unhurt beside them, it almost did. Then Eli's voice came cracking out of the dark, thin and frightened from somewhere near the tree line. "Cole! Cole, over here, quick! There's a man down." They found him 20 yards into the brush, half hidden where he'd fallen from his horse in the retreat. A young man barely past 20. By the look of him clutching a shoulder wound that Clara realized with a lurch of horror had come not from Samuel's warning shots, but from something else entirely. A wound that looked days old, poorly tended infection already setting in, dark and angry around the edges. "That ain't from tonight," Samuel said, crouching beside him, voice gone careful. "Boy's been carrying this a while." The young man's eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever and fear, and fixed on Cole with something that looked unmistakably like relief rather than defiance. "Please," he rasped. "Please don't shoot. I didn't want to come out here tonight. He made us." "Who made you?" Cole crouched down slow, keeping his voice even, despite the fury Clara could still see banked behind his eyes. "Say his name." "Blackwell." The word came out on a broken breath, half sob. "Victor Blackwell. Said if I didn't ride with his men tonight, he'd tell the sheriff I stole from him. Said he'd see me hang for it, even though I never took a thing that wasn't owed me in wages he never paid." His hand found Cole's sleeve, gripping weak and desperate. "I got shot doing a job for him 3 weeks back out past the old Averill place. Man wouldn't even let his own doctor look at it proper because he didn't want questions asked about where I'd got hurt." Clara's breath caught. "The Averill place." The young man's fevered eyes found her. "You know that name." "We do," Cole said, low and urgent now, understanding dawning fast across his face. "What happened out there? What were you doing on the old Averill land?" "Digging," the young man said, voice fading, exhaustion and fever pulling him under. "Blackwell had us digging up a section near the old boundary marker. Looking for something. Papers may be buried in a strongbox old man Averill's from before he sold. Blackwell said there was something out there that could ruin him if the wrong person found it first. Man near tore that whole hillside apart looking, and when I asked what for, he pistol-whipped me and told me to keep digging or find another way to feed myself." His grip on Cole's sleeve went slack. "I need a doctor, mister, please. I'm not lying to you. I'm not one of his men, not really. I'm just a man who needed the work and didn't ask enough questions before it was too late to say no." Cole looked at Clara over the young man's head, and something passed between them. Wordless and urgent. The same understanding arriving in both of them at once. "There's something buried on the Averill land," Clara breathed. "Something Blackwell's desperate enough to hurt his own men looking for. And desperate enough to threaten a wounded boy with the noose to keep him quiet about it," Cole said grimly. He turned back to the young man, voice gentling. "What's your name, son?" "Jed. Jed Coyle." "Jed. You help us find whatever Blackwell's been digging for out there, and you tell a judge everything you just told me, and I'll see you get a doctor tonight and a fair wage besides, and Blackwell won't lay a hand on you again, as long as I've got breath in me to stop him. You understand?" Jed Coyle's eyes filled with something that looked in the lantern light very much like a man realizing he'd finally been offered a way out of a trap he'd stopped believing he could escape. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Yes, I'll tell it all." They got him back to the ranch house by midnight, laid out on a cot in the front room, while Clara boiled water and tore clean linens for a poultice, her hands moving fast and sure, even as her mind raced through everything he'd said. Cole sent Eli riding hard for the doctor, despite the hour, and paced the length of the front room like a man who couldn't hold still, even if his life depended on it, which Clara understood, in a manner of speaking, it very much did. Something buried on the Averill land, Cole said, mostly to himself, turning the belt buckle over and over in his fingers like a worry stone. Something Blackwell's terrified of somebody else finding. What in God's name would a man bury on land he already stole? Evidence. Clara said, not looking up from the poultice she was working, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. Evidence of exactly how he stole it. Averill's own records, maybe. Proof of what really happened to force that sale hidden somewhere Blackwell thought was safe, until he realized whoever bought the land next might find it and put the pieces together the same way I did tonight, going through your father's boxes. Cole stopped pacing. You think Averill hid something, he said slowly, before he lost the ranch. Something that could prove what Blackwell did to him. I think a man doesn't lose everything to a neighbor without trying to leave some kind of trail behind in case anybody ever came looking, Clara said. And I think Blackwell spent 3 weeks tearing up that hillside because he knows it too and hasn't found it yet. Jed Coyle, drifting in and out of a fevered half-sleep on the cot, stirred at that and forced his eyes open one more time. There's a tree, he mumbled. Old dead cottonwood split by lightning still standing near the boundary marker. Blackwell had us dig everywhere around it special. Kept saying if it's anywhere it's near that tree. Never did find it though. Ground's hard as rock that close to the roots. Clara and Cole looked at each other again, and this time, neither one of them needed words at all. The doctor arrived a little past 2 in the morning, grim and half asleep, but competent, and pronounced Jed Coyle likely to keep both his arm and his life, provided the infection didn't turn septic overnight. Cole paid him double his usual rate and asked him plain and direct to say nothing to anyone in town about where he'd spent his evening, and the doctor, who had apparently seen enough of Victor Blackwell's methods over the years to need no further explanation, agreed without a single question asked. Clara didn't sleep at all that night. She sat up with Jed Coyle until dawn, changing the poultice spooning broth past his cracked lips when the fever allowed it, and found herself somewhere in the small hours, praying over a stranger's recovery with an intensity that surprised her. Not out of simple mercy, though there was plenty of that too, but because some fierce and stubborn part of her understood that this frightened, wounded young man was about to become the single most important witness in the fight for Cole Harrison's entire future. Samuel rode out to find Thomas Averill's cousin at first light, armed with the address Clara had found in the old contract, while Cole and 2 of the more trusted hands began the grim, careful work of digging around the base of the old split cottonwood on what used to be Averill land, and was now on paper at least a corner of the Circle B. They found it on the second day 4 feet down, wrapped in oiled canvas, gone soft and dark with years underground. A strong box rusted through at the hinges, but still intact enough that Cole had to force it open with a crowbar, and inside, preserved just well enough by the oilcloth wrapping to still be legible. A stack of papers that made Cole go pale as he read through them by lantern light back at the kitchen table that night. Averill's own ledger, he said, voice hushed with something between triumph and fury. Dates amounts every payment Blackwell made to men in this valley to spread lies about him. A letter unsent addressed to a territorial judge laying out everything Blackwell did to force the sale poison stock, cut fence. False accusations of cattle theft filed with the sheriff Blackwell had in his pocket, even back then. And this. His hand shook as he held up the last page. A signed statement from Averill himself, swearing every word of it true, dated the week before he left the territory for good. Clara felt her whole chest go tight with something fierce and hopeful. That's enough, she breathed. Cole, that's enough to bring to a judge. That's proof. It's proof of what he did to Averill, Cole said, some of the hope in his voice tempering into caution. Might not be enough on its own to stop what he's building against me right now. But paired with Jed's testimony, paired with what you found in my father's boxes about the other 3 ranches, he swallowed the same way. He looked up at her, and something in his face had shifted, hardened into a kind of certainty she hadn't seen in him before. This is a case now, Clara. A real one. Man like Blackwell's been getting away with this for over a decade because nobody before us ever thought to look this hard or had someone standing beside them clever enough to know where to look. We're not finished yet, Clara said. Samuel's not back from finding the Averill family. We don't have their sworn word yet, not officially, and I don't imagine Blackwell's going to sit quiet while we build a case against him. No, Cole agreed grimly. He surely won't. He was right, and it took less than 2 days to prove it. Samuel returned on the third day with more than they'd hoped for. Not just Thomas Averill's cousin, but Thomas Averill's own son, grown now bitter and hollow-eyed with a decade of watching his father drink himself slowly toward an early grave over the shame and ruin of a stolen ranch, and more than willing, eager to swear before any judge in the territory exactly what Victor Blackwell had done to his family. "My father never got over it," the younger Averill said, sitting stiff and tense at Cole's kitchen table, voice rough with old grief. "Man built that ranch out of nothing, same as your daddy did his, and watched it get stolen right out from under him by lies and poison, and a sheriff too scared or too paid off to do a blessed thing about it. He tried to fight it same as you're fighting now, didn't have the proof or the money for a lawyer good enough to make the proof matter. Died believing nobody would ever hold that man to account." His jaw tightened. "You're telling me there's a chance now, a real one?" "There's a chance," Cole said, "but it means putting your name on paper, testifying in front of a judge, maybe in front of the whole territory if it comes to that. Blackwell's got money and friends in high places. He won't take kindly to being called out." "Mr. the younger Averill said, and something raw and furious burned behind his tired eyes. "I've waited 11 years for somebody to give me the chance to say his name out loud in a courtroom and watch him have to answer for it. You couldn't stop me from testifying now if you tried." It should have felt in that moment like the tide had finally turned for good. It lasted exactly one more day. The rider came at dusk alone, dressed neat and formal in a way that immediately made Clara's stomach drop. Not a hired hand, not a threat delivered in the dark, but a man in a proper coat carrying a leather case, the kind of man who did his damage in daylight with paper instead of poison. "Mr. Harrison." He dismounted at the edge of the yard, formal and unhurried. Warren Dobbs' attorney representing Mr. Victor Blackwell of the Circle B Ranch. Cole came out onto the porch, jaw already tight. "What do you want, Mr. Dobbs?" "I've come to serve notice, sir." Dobbs opened his leather case and produced a folded document, holding it out with the careful, bloodless courtesy of a man delivering bad news he did not personally relish, but had been well paid to deliver anyway. "Mr. Blackwell has filed a legal claim against the water rights currently attached to your western pasture, along with a boundary dispute concerning approximately 400 acres of your southern range, based on an original territorial survey dated some 31 years back, predating your father's purchase of this land." Cole's face went the color of ash as he scanned the document. "This is forged," he said flatly. "My father's deed is clean. Recorded, witnessed, filed proper at the county office the same year he bought this land." "That may well be, sir," Dobbs said, entirely unmoved. "The court will determine the matter's validity in due course. In the meantime, I'm obligated to inform you that Mr. Blackwell has requested and been granted a temporary injunction, restricting your use of the disputed water source pending the hearing." He glanced almost apologetically toward the corrals and the distant cattle grazing beyond them. "I understand that's rather a significant portion of your operation's water supply. It's the only reliable water on this side of the valley," Cole said, voice gone dangerously quiet. "You know that. Blackwell knows that. Cut me off from it and my whole herd's dead inside 2 weeks. The hearing is set for 9 days from now at the territorial courthouse," Dobbs said, folding his hands, entirely unbothered by the fury radiating off the man in front of him. "I'd advise you to have proper legal counsel of your own by then, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Blackwell intends to press his claim vigorously." He tipped his hat, exactly the same mocking half-courtesy his employer favored, and rode off into the gathering dark, without another word, leaving Cole standing on the porch with a forged survey document shaking in his fist, and 9 days between him and the possible loss of everything his family had built. Clara came to stand beside him, reading the paper over his shoulder, feeling the ground shift beneath her, same as it had on that train platform weeks ago. The sudden vertiginous drop of a future she'd started to believe in, threatening to collapse out from under her all over again. 9 days, she said quietly. 9 days, Cole confirmed, to prove in front of a territorial judge that a man who's spent a decade stealing ranches through lies and poison and forged paper is doing it again right now, or lose the water this whole operation depends on, and likely the ranch along with it. We have Jed's testimony, Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady, fighting the same fear that had gripped her on that hilltop days before, when she'd admitted for the first time how much she stood to lose. We have Averil's strongbox. We have his son ready to testify. We have 4 ranches worth of pattern laid out plain in your father's old boxes. We have all of that, Cole agreed. What we don't have is 9 days worth of certainty that it's enough, or that Blackwell doesn't have some other trick left to play before we ever set foot in that courthouse. He was, as it turned out, entirely right to worry. The trick came 4 days later at the Founders' Day social held in the town square, an event Clara had almost refused to attend, still raw from Mrs. Pruitt's poison at the general store weeks before, until Cole had taken her hand and told her quiet and certain that hiding from a fight never once won it, and that if she wanted the whole valley to see the truth of who she was, before the hearing, there was no better stage to claim it on than the one gossip had already built for her. She should have trusted her first instinct. The square was crowded, lanterns strung between the buildings, a fiddle playing somewhere near the church steps. The whole town gathered in a rare mood of celebration that Clara found herself, despite everything, almost able to enjoy. Right up until Victor Blackwell stepped up onto the small speaker's platform at the square's center, raised his hands for quiet, and began to speak. "Friends," he said, voice carrying easy and practiced across the gathered crowd, the voice of a man well used to being listened to. "I don't mean to interrupt this fine evening's festivities, but I feel a certain obligation, as a longtime member of this community, to address some troubling rumors that have reached my ears." Clara felt Cole go rigid beside her. "There's been talk," Blackwell continued, "of accusations against me. Wild claims, I'm told, about stolen land and poisoned wells and hired men doing my dirty work in the dark. I understand where such stories originate, and I understand, too, that desperate people sometimes tell desperate lies to protect what little standing they've managed to claw together for themselves." His eyes found Clara across the crowd, and Clara felt every eye in the square follow that gaze, felt the whole town turn to look at her at once. "Take Miss Whitmore here," Blackwell said, and his voice dropped into something almost gentle, almost pitying, which somehow made it so much worse than open cruelty would have been. "A mail-order bride abandoned on a train platform not 2 months back, taken in that same day by a lonely rancher, sitting on the most valuable water rights in this valley. Now suddenly there's talk of forged surveys of stolen ranches, of a conspiracy against me stretching back a decade, all conveniently surfacing right as I pursue a legitimate legal claim to land that was always rightfully mine." He shook his head, slow and sorrowful, playing the crowd like a fiddle. "I don't say this to wound anyone. I say it because this town deserves the truth. A woman with nothing to her name, suddenly this clever, this convenient, this determined to see me ruined. One has to ask what she truly hopes to gain from all of it. A husband's protection, a share in whatever's left of his land. Once. I'm run off it. I leave you all to draw your own conclusions." The square went dead silent. Clara felt the words land like physical blows, each one worse than the last. And for one terrible, suspended moment, standing there with the whole town's eyes fixed on her, she felt exactly the way she'd felt on that train platform 2 months ago. Small, exposed, judged before she'd ever had the chance to speak a single word in her own defense. Cole's hand found hers, gripping tight. "Clara." "No," she said, quiet but iron steady, and pulled her hand free, not in rejection, but because some fierce and long-buried part of her understood with sudden and total clarity that this was not a moment for Cole to fight on her behalf. This was a moment she had to claim for herself. She stepped forward out of the crowd, up toward the edge of the speaker's platform, and the whole square seemed to hold its breath, watching her do it. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. and her voice, to her own considerable surprise, came out clear and steady enough to carry across the entire square without a single crack in it. "You're right about one thing. I did arrive in this town with nothing. I sold my mother's wedding ring for train fare to marry a man who never had the courage to meet me at the station himself. I stood on that platform in front of half this town, while you all watched and whispered, and I have never once pretended that morning wasn't the worst humiliation of my life." She let that sit a moment, watching it land, watching the crowd's attention sharpen rather than scatter. "But you're wrong about everything else," she continued, voice rising steadier with every word. "I did not conspire with Cole Harrison to steal your land. I found evidence of what you did to Thomas Averill because I spent a night going through 8 years of neglected paperwork, doing honest work I was hired and paid to do. I found 4 other ranches you swallowed the same way over a decade, using poison and fear and lies exactly like the ones you're telling this crowd about me right now." Her eyes swept the gathered faces, dozens of them watching the doubt she'd expected slowly give way here and there to something more uncertain. "You want this town to believe I'm a desperate woman scheming for a share of another man's land. I'd ask this town instead to consider why a man as wealthy and as powerful as Victor Blackwell feels the need to stand on a platform and attack a housekeeper's character in public, rather than simply answering plainly whether the accusations against him are true." Blackwell's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for those close enough to see it. "This is absurd. I owe you no accounting of my business dealings, Miss Whitmore." "No," Clara agreed. "You owe an accounting to a judge 9 days from now, and to the son of Thomas Averill, who will be standing in that courtroom to tell exactly what you did to his father, and to a young man named Jed Coyle, recovering in Cole Harrison's own front room from a bullet wound he took doing dirty work for you that he was too frightened to refuse." She let the names hang in the air, watching them land on Blackwell's face like blows he hadn't braced for. "You called me desperate tonight, Mr. Blackwell, in front of this whole town. I'd say the desperate man here is the one who felt he had to attack a stranger's character in public, rather than risk facing the truth in a courtroom." The square erupted into a low, urgent murmur, dozens of conversations breaking out at once, and Clara watched with something like disbelief, the tide of the crowd's attention shift, not entirely, not all at once, but enough that Blackwell's easy command of the platform had visibly unmistakably faltered. "Mrs. Pruitt," Clara said, turning suddenly toward the older woman who stood near the front of the crowd, face gone pale. "You told me weeks ago that desperate women say anything to protect what they've clawed together. I'd ask you tonight, in 11 years of Victor Blackwell buying up this valley, one ruined family at a time, how many of those families were desperate first, and how many of them only became desperate after he was finished with them?" Mrs. Pruitt said nothing at all, and her silence, Clara understood, said more than any words could have. Blackwell stepped down from the platform without another word, jaw tight, eyes promising a reckoning. Clara understood was far from finished and disappeared into the crowd, with Warren Dobbs trailing close behind him, already murmuring something urgent that Clara couldn't hear. Cole reached her a moment later, pushing through the crowd, and did not say a single word, simply pulled her into his arms, right there in front of the whole town, and held her the way a man holds something he'd been half-braced to lose, and had at the last possible moment been given back instead. "You didn't need me to fight that one," he murmured into her hair. "No," Clara agreed, voice shaking now that the adrenaline was finally draining out of her, now that she'd allowed herself to feel all at once exactly how frightened she'd been standing up there. "But I'm awfully glad you were standing close enough to catch me when it was over." They rode home that night with the whole valley still buzzing behind them, and for the first time since Warren Dobbs had ridden into their yard with his forged survey and his 9-day deadline, Clara let herself believe just slightly that the tide had genuinely turned. It turned again hard 4 days before the hearing. Samuel found the fire before anyone else did smoke, rising thick and black against the pre-dawn sky from the direction of the old cottonwood tree. And by the time Cole and the hands reached it, the strongbox hiding place had been dug up and torn apart. Papers scattered and burned, the physical evidence of Averill's ledger and letter reduced to ash and half-legible fragments. He knew! Cole said, standing over the wreckage with something cold and furious settling into his voice. Somehow he knew exactly where we found it. Jed, Samuel said grimly. Only person besides us who knew that hiding spot. Jed wouldn't, Clara said, immediately fierce in his defense. I've sat with that boy every night for a week. He's terrified of Blackwell, not loyal to him. Terrified men do desperate things, Samuel said, though not unkindly. Might not even have meant to tell. Fever talks when a man's mind ain't his own. They found Jed Coyle gone from his cot. When they returned to the house, the front door standing open, a single hastily scrawled note left behind on the kitchen table, in handwriting still shaky from illness and fear. He found me. Said if I testify, he'll make sure I hang for a theft. I never committed false witnesses already lined up to swear to it. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I have to run. Clara read it twice, feeling something cold and sick settle into her stomach, and looked up at Cole, whose face had gone the particular still ashen calm of a man absorbing a blow too large to fully register all at once. Without Jed, Cole said slowly. Without the strongbox, we've got Averil's son's word against Blackwell's money and Blackwell's lawyer and Blackwell's decade of buying silence in this valley. That's not nothing. But it's a great deal less than what we had 4 days ago. 4 days, Clara said, feeling the weight of it settle over her like a physical thing. 4 days, and the case we spent weeks building just went up in smoke and rode off into the night, and I don't know if what's left of it is enough to save this ranch at all. Cole looked out toward the ridge, toward the direction Blackwell's land lay, somewhere beyond it, and something hard and unyielding settled into the line of his jaw. Then we've got 4 days to find something else, he said. Because I did not survive losing my mother and my father, and near everything else this land ever cost me, only to hand the rest of it over to a man like Victor Blackwell, without one more fight left in me. Clara stepped closer, took his hand in both of hers and held on. Then we better start now, she said. Because I didn't survive what it cost me to get here, either, only to watch it all get taken away 4 days before we were supposed to win. They rode for the county seat before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, 3 hours hard in the saddle, and Clara spent every mile of it turning the problem over in her mind. The same relentless way she'd once turned over a ledger full of numbers that refused to balance until she found the one entry hiding the whole truth. The strong box is gone, she said as the courthouse spire finally came into view above the trees. But a strong box isn't the only place proof can live. Averil filed a complaint once, didn't he? You said as much yourself, that people knew something had happened, even if nobody proved it. Filed and ignored, Cole said grimly. Sheriff back then was Blackwell's man, same as the current one's proving to be. Then we don't go to the sheriff, Clara said. We go to the county recorder. A complaint that gets filed and ignored doesn't disappear, Cole. It gets buried. There's a difference. The recorder's office turned out to be run by a narrow, ink-stained man named Foster, who looked for the first 10 minutes of their visit entirely unwilling to be helpful to anyone connected to a fight against Victor Blackwell, until Clara set the newspaper clipping about the Averil sale on his desk and asked him plain and direct whether a man who'd spent 30 years keeping this valley's records straight could really live with himself, helping bury the truth about how those records got so crooked in the first place. Foster stared at the clipping a long moment. Then, without a word, he rose and disappeared into the archive room and came back 20 minutes later with a folder gone soft with age, containing exactly what Clara had gambled existed. Thomas Averil's original written complaint filed and dated, describing in his own hand the poisoned stock, the false accusations, the pressure that had finally broken him into selling. Never got acted on, Foster said quietly, sliding the folder across the desk. Sheriff at the time told me himself to file it and forget it. I filed it. Never did manage the forgetting part. Will you testify to that? Cole asked. That this complaint was filed and buried on the sheriff's order. Foster was quiet a long moment, glancing toward the window, toward the town beyond it, where Victor Blackwell's name carried more weight than most men's law. I've got 30 years left on my pension, riding on staying quiet about things like this, he said finally, and about 11 years of not sleeping right, knowing I helped bury a good man's ruin because I was too much of a coward to do otherwise. He met Cole's eyes. "I'll testify." It was one piece. Not everything they'd lost in the fire, but something solid, something sworn, something Victor Blackwell couldn't burn because it had never been in his reach to burn in the first place. They found Jed Coyle the following afternoon thanks to Samuel's tracking and a rancher 3 valleys over, who remembered a feverish young stranger begging shelter in his barn 2 nights running. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, flinching at every sound by the time they found him curled in the hayloft, and it took the better part of an hour, Clara sitting close and speaking low and steady, the way she might have gentled the spooked mare weeks before, to convince him they hadn't come to drag him back against his will. "He'll kill me," Jed said, over and over, voice cracking with a fear that went beyond reason, now beyond anything words alone could talk him down from. "You don't know what he's capable of. False witnesses already lined up," he said. "Said the noose'd be waiting whether I'm guilty or not because guilty's whatever he decides to pay a jury to believe." "I know exactly what he's capable of," Cole said, crouching down to Jed's level voice, low and level, and utterly without threat in it. "I've got a burned strongbox, and a ruined pasture, and a note nailed to a well post to prove it. But I'm telling you now, plain as I know how the circuit judge writing in for this hearing is a federal appointee, not a county man. Blackwell's bought and paid for. He answers to territory law, not to Victor Blackwell's money. And I will personally see you and your testimony protected every hour between now and that courtroom with my own rifle, if it comes to it, and work waiting for you on my land long after the hearing's done, if that's what it takes for you to believe you've got a future worth showing up for." Jed looked at him a long moment, then at Clara, who had not once in the whole hour of talking him down let go of his hand. "You really believe you can beat him?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I believe the truth's on our side," Cole said. "And I believe a boy who took a bullet doing another man's dirty work and still had the conscience to feel sick about it deserves a chance to stand up and say so out loud if he's brave enough to take it." Jed was quiet another long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll come," he said. "God help me, I'll come." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold. The whole town, it seemed, gathered outside the territorial courthouse before the doors had even opened, drawn by weeks of gossip that had finally curdled in most quarters from mockery of Clara into something far more dangerous for Victor Blackwell, genuine open curiosity about exactly what kind of man he truly was. Inside the courtroom filled fast benches creaking under the weight of half the valley's ranchers and townsfolk, all of them come to watch the outcome of a fight that had by now stopped being merely Cole Harrison's fight and become something the whole community had a stake in seeing resolved. Victor Blackwell sat at his table beside Warren Dobbs, composed, immaculate, utterly unbothered in appearance, though Clara, watching from beside Cole at the opposing table, saw the way his knuckles had gone white where his hands rested folded before him. Judge Elias Cartwright, gray-bearded, sharp-eyed, entirely unfamiliar to the local rumor mill, and therefore Clara understood with a flicker of relief entirely unbought, called the proceedings to order with a single sharp rap of his gavel. "This court is here to determine the validity of a survey claim filed by Mr. Victor Blackwell against water rights and disputed acreage currently held by Mr. Cole Harrison," the judge said, voice carrying flat and even across the packed room. "Mr. Dobbs, you may present your client's claim." Dobbs rose smooth and practiced, and laid out Blackwell's case with the polished ease of a man who had done this exact dance a great many times before. A survey document, aged and official-looking, purporting to establish original territorial boundaries that placed the disputed water source and acreage rightfully within Circle B land, predating Cole's father's deed by several years. A simple matter of an older claim superseding a newer one, Your Honor, Dobbs concluded. My client seeks only what the original survey has always shown to be rightfully his. Mr. Harrison, Judge Cartwright said, turning his sharp gaze toward Cole's table. Your response. Cole rose, and Clara watched him steady himself with a breath before he spoke, watched the same quiet resolve she'd first seen in him on a train platform 2 months ago, settle now across his whole bearing. Your Honor, that survey is a forgery, he said plainly, and I intend to prove it, along with proving that this is not the first time Victor Blackwell has used a forged document and a campaign of intimidation to steal land that was never his." The courtroom erupted into a low murmur that took the judge's gavel 2 sharp raps to settle. Cole called Foster first, and the recorder hands trembling only slightly. Laid out Thomas Averill's buried complaint for the court, described the sheriff's order to file and forget it, and confirmed under Dobbs's sharp cross-examination that he had personally overseen the county's survey records for 3 decades, and had never once in all that time seen or filed any territorial survey matching the document Blackwell now presented as genuine. "If such a survey existed," Foster said, steady now despite his earlier trembling, "it would have crossed my desk. It never did." Dobbs pressed him hard, suggested oversight, suggested a filing error, suggested the survey might simply predate Foster's own tenure, until Cole called his second witness, a licensed territorial surveyor Clara had spent 2 of the 4 remaining days tracking down and paying out of her own thin savings, alongside Cole's, to examine the disputed document. "The ink and the paper stock," the surveyor testified, holding the document up for the court to see, "are consistent with materials manufactured within the last 5 years, not 31. The aging on the page is artificial scorched most likely, and treated with tea or a similar staining agent to simulate the appearance of age. This document was not created 31 years ago, Your Honor. I would stake my professional reputation on it having been created within the last several months." Blackwell's composure cracked visibly, this time a muscle in his jaw jumping hard enough that half the courtroom saw it. Then Thomas Averill's son took the stand and told the room in a voice that shook with 11 years of buried grief and fury exactly what had happened to his father's ranch. The poisoned stock, the false accusations, the sheriff who wouldn't investigate the sale forced through under threats, dressed up as neighborly persuasion, and the slow, grinding shame that had followed his father to an early grave, believing no one would ever hold Victor Blackwell to account. Dobbs objected repeatedly. The judge overruled him every time, jaw set, eyes hard. Clearly a man who had seen enough frontier land grabs in his circuit to recognize the shape of one unfolding in front of him. It was near midday when Cole called his final witness, and the courtroom doors opened at the back to admit Jed Coyle, pale and thin, but upright, walking with Samuel close at his shoulder the whole way to the witness stand. And Clara felt her whole chest tighten, watching him take the oath, with a hand that trembled but did not falter. He told it all. The bullet he'd taken digging for Averill's buried evidence. The threats against his life if he refused to ride against Cole's herd. The false witnesses Blackwell had bragged in his hearing about having ready to swear Jed guilty of theft he'd never committed, should Jed ever think of testifying against him. "Why come forward now?" Cole asked him gently from where he stood beside the witness stand. "After everything he threatened you with." Jed's eyes found Clara in the gallery before he answered, and something steadied in his voice when he spoke. "Because somebody finally made me believe the truth was worth more than staying scared," he said. "And because I got tired of being a man who let fear decide everything for him." The courtroom was dead silent when he stepped down. Warren Dobbs made one last effort, rising to argue that a wounded, fevered young man's testimony under duress carried little weight, that the surveyor's opinion was merely an opinion, that the whole case amounted to a conspiracy of convenience against a respected businessman. Judge Cartwright let him finish, then set down his pen with a deliberate final sort of quiet that made the whole room lean forward. "Mr. Dobbs," he said, "I have sat on this bench 18 years and heard a great many forged documents defended a great many creative ways. I have rarely heard 4 independent witnesses, a recorder's buried complaint, a licensed surveyor's professional testimony, and a wounded young man's sworn account all point so consistently in the same direction by pure coincidence." He turned his gaze on Victor Blackwell, who sat rigid and pale at his table, all his earlier composure finally entirely gone. "It is the finding of this court that the survey document presented by the plaintiff is fraudulent, and that the claim against Mr. Harrison's water rights and disputed acreage is dismissed in full." Furthermore, given the substantial evidence presented today regarding the acquisition of the Averill Ranch and the pattern of similar conduct suggested in these proceedings, I am ordering a formal territorial investigation into Mr. Blackwell's business dealings over the past decade, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted. Clara didn't remember standing. She only remembered suddenly being on her feet. Tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry, finally spilling hot down her face, and Cole's arms coming around her from behind, lifting her half off her feet in a fierce, unrestrained embrace that neither of them seemed to care was happening in front of half the valley. "We did it," he said into her hair voice, rough with something that sounded for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded. "Clara, we did it." Across the room, Victor Blackwell rose from his table without a word, face gray, and walked out of that courthouse, a man whose empire of quiet theft had finally publicly irrevocably begun to unravel. Warren Dobbs trailing silent and grim behind him, and not one person in that crowded gallery moved to comfort him on his way out. Thomas Averill's son found Clara before she and Cole made it out of the building and took her hand in both of his eyes wet. 11 years, he said, voice thick. 11 years I've carried what happened to my father, believing nobody would ever care enough to prove it true. You cared enough, Miss Whitmore. Whatever this town said about you before today, I hope every one of them heard what I heard in that courtroom. Clara found she couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat, and simply nodded and let him go, and turned back to find Cole watching her with an expression so full of something fierce and tender and entirely unguarded that it stole whatever words she might have managed anyway. The ride home felt different than any ride they'd taken together before it. The road was the same. The valley was the same. The long gold light of late afternoon fell across the grass exactly as it always had, and yet Clara found herself watching it all as though she were seeing it for the first time. Not as a stranger passing through borrowed land, but as someone who had bled in her own quiet way to help keep it standing. News of the ruling had beaten them home. By the time the wagon rolled into the yard, Samuel and Eli were already waiting, and the moment Cole swung down and gave the smallest nod of confirmation, Eli let out a whoop loud enough to send birds scattering from the barn roof. And even Samuel allowed himself a rare, full smile, gripping Cole's hand hard enough to make the younger man wince. "Knew it," Eli kept saying, grinning ear to ear. "Knew he wouldn't beat you. Not with Miss Whitmore in your corner." Jed Coyle, still pale but standing straighter than Clara had seen him stand since the night they'd found him bleeding in the brush, hung back near the porch steps, uncertain of his welcome even now, until Cole crossed the yard and clasped his hand firm. "Told you I'd see you protected," Cole said. "Told you there'd be work waiting too if you wanted it. Offer still stands, Jed. Man who found the courage to do what you did today's earned a place on this ranch as far as I'm concerned." Jed's eyes went bright and wet, and he could only manage a rough, grateful nod in answer. That evening's supper was louder and longer than any Clara had cooked since her first night in that kitchen, the whole table crowded with relief and laughter, and the particular giddy exhaustion of people who had spent days bracing for disaster, and were only now allowing themselves to believe it wasn't coming. Clara found herself laughing harder than she had in years watching Eli reenact Judge Cartwright's final ruling with theatrical gravity, watching Samuel roll his eyes, but not once tell the boy to stop. It was only later, after the dishes were cleared, and the men had drifted out to the bunkhouse, still trading pieces of the day between them, that the quiet finally caught up with her. She found Cole out on the porch, alone, looking out over the darkening yard, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent so long braced for a blow that he didn't quite know now what to do with the sudden absence of one. "You should be celebrating," Clara said, coming to stand beside him. "I am," Cole said. "Just quieter than the rest of them, I suppose. Never was much good at being loud about the things that matter most." She looked at him a long moment in the porch light. This man who had met her at a train station 2 months ago, with nothing to offer but hard truth and a stranger's kindness, who had stood between her and a town's cruelty more than once, since who had just spent the better part of a week fighting alongside her for a future neither of them had been entirely certain they'd get to keep. "We won," she said softly, as though saying it aloud might finally make it feel real. "We did." Cole turned to look at her fully, and something in his gaze had gone quiet, and searching the same careful weighing she'd first noticed in him on that platform. Except this time, there was no hard truth waiting behind it. Nothing but plain and unguarded want. "Clara, I know I already said my piece once up on that ridge before the shooting started and put everything else on hold. I meant every word of it then. I mean it more now, having watched you stand in front of that whole town and fight for this place like it already belonged to you." Clara's breath caught the same way it had on the ridge, except this time there was no gunshot waiting to interrupt them, no crisis pulling them apart before she could answer. "It's strange," she said quietly. 2 months ago I stood on a platform in this valley with nothing left in the world, and tonight I stood in a courtroom and helped save a home I still don't fully believe is mine to claim." "It could be," Cole said low and certain. "If you wanted it to be." The porch light flickered moths circling close, and somewhere out past the corral, a horse shifted and stamped in the dark, and Clara stood there with her heart pounding, feeling the whole shape of the last 2 months settle around her. The humiliation and the fear, the ledgers and the fence lines, the courtroom and the gunfire, and the slow, unlikely warmth of a house that had somehow, without her quite noticing when it happened, stopped feeling like someone else's home and started feeling like her own. She did not answer him that night. Not with words. She only reached for his hand in the dark and held on, and let that be. Answer enough for now, while the whole valley settled quiet around them, and Victor Blackwell's ruin spread slow and certain through every county record between there and the territorial seat. The weeks that followed settled into something Clara had never quite let herself imagine having. Again a rhythm so steady, so ordinary, that some mornings she woke half convinced she'd dreamed the whole ordeal with Blackwell, until she caught sight of the belt buckle Cole still kept on his office shelf. A small deliberate reminder of exactly what they'd both survived to get here. The territorial investigation into Victor Blackwell's affairs moved slow the way such things always did, but word filtered back. Steady enough 2 more ranchers had come forward. Once his name started cracking in public, a federal marshal had been assigned to the case, and Warren Dobbs. It was rumored had already quietly withdrawn as his counsel, rather than risk his own reputation going down with his clients. Blackwell still rode into town on occasion, thinner now, quieter, stripped of the easy command he'd once carried like a birthright, and nobody in Red Hollow troubled themselves any longer to give him more than a cold nod. Clara found she didn't think of him much at all anymore. She had other things filling her days. The ranch ran different now, lighter somehow, as though the whole property had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Eli had finally worked up the nerve to properly court the girl he'd bought ribbon for, and came back from town most Sundays, grinning so wide Samuel threatened, only half joking, to charge him rent for the extra foolishness he was tracking through the kitchen. Jed Coyle had taken to ranch work with the quiet, grateful diligence of a man who understood exactly how easily he might have lost the chance to have any work at all. And Samuel, gruff as ever, had started teaching him to rope, like he might a son he'd never had. And Cole watched her still the way he had from the very first week, except there was no longer anything careful or uncertain in it. He found reasons to be near her that neither of them bothered pretending were really about ledgers or fences anymore. He'd taken in the evenings to sitting across from her at the kitchen table, simply to talk about nothing in particular, and everything at once, and Clara had come to treasure those quiet hours more than she'd ever expected to treasure anything again. She still hadn't given him her answer. It sat between them unspoken, but never quite forgotten, in every lingering glance, every hand that found hers and held a beat too long before letting go. Cole never pushed. He'd promised her time back on that ridge, and he was keeping the promise even now, weeks after the courtroom, weeks after the porch. But Clara could feel the 6-month mark creeping closer on the calendar all the same, and some stubborn, frightened part of her still hadn't let go of the old arithmetic that had carried her through 3 years of loss. 6 months. That had been the agreement. And agreements, Clara had learned the hard way, were the only promises a person could really trust. There was a night not long before the letter came when that old fear nearly won. She'd been lying awake, listening to the house settle around her the way it always did, and had found herself in the particular loneliness of 2 a.m, drafting in her mind the kind of careful, practical letter she knew how to write better than almost anything else. A letter thanking Cole for his kindness, explaining that 6 months had been the agreement, and 6 months was what she intended to honor, that she'd start fresh somewhere new, rather than risk becoming a burden. He'd only invited out of decency in the first place. She got as far as lighting the lamp and reaching for paper before she stopped herself, hand trembling, staring at the blank page like it might tell her which fear was the truer one. The fear of losing this life, or the fear of trusting it enough to keep it. She put the paper away, unwritten, but the fear didn't leave with it. It simply went quiet, waiting the way old fears always did for the next excuse to speak up loud again. The letter came on a gray Tuesday, 3 weeks before the 6 months were up, and gave that fear exactly the excuse it had been waiting for. Nathaniel Carter. She stood in the front hall a long moment, staring at her own name in his careful, looping script, feeling something old and complicated twist in her chest. Not longing, she realized almost immediately, nothing so simple as that, but something closer to disbelief that the life she'd nearly had could still reach for her from so far away. She opened it at the kitchen table alone, hands steadier than she expected. "Dear Miss Whitmore," it began. "I have heard through channels I won't trouble you with of your remarkable circumstances since our unfortunate correspondence ended. I find myself, upon reflection, deeply regretful of the manner in which I handled our arrangement, and wish to inquire whether you might consider, given the change in both our circumstances, a renewed correspondence. My family's objections have since been resolved, and I remain as I was then, in want of a wife of your evident character and capability." Clara read it twice and then a third time, and felt to her own considerable surprise almost nothing at all. No anger, no wistfulness. Only a strange, clean clarity, the kind that comes when a door you once believed mattered turns out upon a second look to have never really been a door at all. She was still sitting there, letter in hand, when Cole came in from the barn and found her. "What's that?" he asked, something careful entering his voice at the sight of her face. "Nathaniel Carter," Clara said, and watched Cole's whole body go still. "He's heard about the ranch, about Blackwell, about me apparently being rather more remarkable than he first gave me credit for." She set the letter down, folded it once precise. "He's asking me to reconsider him." The silence that followed felt longer than it likely was. "And what do you intend to tell him?" Cole asked, and Clara heard beneath the careful evenness of his voice something raw and frightened that he was working very hard not to let show. She looked up at him, really looked the way she had on that very first day, weighing the whole shape of him against everything she now knew to be true. "I intend to tell him," she said slowly, "that I already found a home, and it wasn't the one he offered." Something in Cole's face cracked open relief and hope tangled so plainly together that he didn't even try to hide it. "Clara, I'm not finished." She stood crossing the kitchen to stand in front of him, closer than she'd let herself stand in weeks, close enough now that neither of them pretended otherwise. "I've been afraid to answer you properly, Cole, not because I doubt what I feel, because 6 months was the agreement, and agreements are the only promises I ever learned to trust. And some frightened part of me has been telling myself this whole time that when the 6 months ends, I'll still be temporary here. Still just passing through, same as I was on that platform." "You were never temporary," Cole said low and fierce. "Not from the first week you scrubbed my stove like it owed you money." A laugh broke out of her, unexpected, cutting through the tightness in her chest. "That obvious, was I?" "That obvious," Cole agreed, and reached for her hands, holding them both in his, steady and warm, the way they'd been steady from the very start. "Clara Whitmore, I don't want 6 months. I don't want a year, or 5, or any number with an ending built into it. I watched you save this ranch, save a stranger's life, stand in front of a whole town, and refuse to be small when they wanted you small. I have loved you, I think, since somewhere around the 2nd week, and I have been too much of a coward most days to say it plain, for fear you'd hear it and run same as Margaret did." "I'm not Margaret," Clara said softly. And this isn't loneliness scaring me off. It's the opposite. I'm scared because I want this so badly I don't trust myself to believe it's real. Then let me make it real, Cole said. Marry me. Not because Nathaniel Carter left you standing on a platform, and not because I need a housekeeper, and not because either one of us is scared of being alone anymore. Marry me because I can't picture a single morning of the rest of my life that doesn't start with you in this kitchen. Clara felt tears rise hot and sudden, and did not fight them this time. Yes, she said, before he'd even finished drawing his next breath. Yes, Cole. My answer's yes. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if speaking the word aloud had used up every ounce of steadiness either of them had left. Then Cole let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, almost like a prayer, and pulled her against him so fast her feet nearly left the floor. Say it again, he murmured against her hair. I want to hear it a second time, just so I know I ain't dreamed it. Yes. Clara said again, laughing now through the tears gripping the front of his shirt, like she meant to make sure he couldn't take the moment back, even if some old fear tried to talk her out of it later. Yes, 100 times over, Cole Harrison. I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her then, right there in the kitchen, where it had all begun 2 months and a lifetime ago, and Clara felt every last brittle piece of the woman who'd stepped off that train with nothing left to lose finally settle quiet and whole into the woman standing here instead, chosen, not left behind. Claimed, not abandoned. Home, not merely housed. Word of the engagement reached the bunkhouse before supper was even on the table, and Eli whooped loud enough that Clara half expected him to wake every steer in the west pasture, while Samuel, gruff as ever, simply shook Cole's hand and told him in a voice thick with something he didn't bother naming, that it was about time this house had a wedding in it again. Jed Coyle turned red to the ears offering his congratulations, and then quieter, thanked Clara again for the 100th time for not letting him run forever. Even Mrs. Pruitt, when the news reached town proper, had the grace to send a small basket of preserves up to the ranch, with nothing but a short, stiff note attached. Wishing you happiness, Mrs. Harrison-to-be, which Clara read twice. Laughed once, sharp and surprised, and decided on the whole to accept as close to an apology as that particular woman was ever likely to offer. Later, long after the letter from Nathaniel Carter had been folded away and forgotten in a drawer, neither of them would ever open again. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the last gold light of evening, watching Cole cross the yard toward her, with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who finally had nowhere else in the world he needed to be, and understood with a clarity that steadied every part of her that she had not simply found a home in this valley. She had built one, and for the first time since the morning she'd stepped off that train, believing herself unwanted, Clara Whitmore let herself believe fully, and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was always meant to end up. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, and by the time the date arrived, Red Hollow had transformed in Clara's eyes, at least into an entirely different town than the one that had watched her stumble off a train 2 seasons earlier. Women who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped to ask after the guest list. The general store owner who'd once served her with tight-lipped courtesy now insisted loudly and more than once on providing the wedding flower at cost. Even the schoolteacher's children had taken to waving at her from the road, calling her Miss Whitmore, in voices bright with none of the old suspicion, and Clara found herself more than once that autumn having to stop mid-errand and simply breathe through the strange, overwhelming grace of being welcomed somewhere she'd once been so thoroughly cast out. She hadn't expected any of it to feel this good. She hadn't let herself expect much of anything for 3 long years. Now here she was, 3 days from her wedding, standing in the middle of a kitchen crowded with borrowed chairs and donated linens and more goodwill than she knew what to do with, and finding the feeling almost too large to hold steady inside her chest. "You're doing that thing again," Cole said, coming up behind her with 2 crates of borrowed dishware balanced against his hip. "What thing?" "Standing real still in the middle of a room, like you're waiting for somebody to tell you it's all been a mistake." He set the crates down and turned her gently by the shoulder to face him. "Nobody's taking this away from you, Clara. Not the wedding, not the town, not me." "I know that," she said, and found to her own quiet relief that she meant it. The trouble when it came arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and for one long, breathless hour threatened to prove her old fear right after all. Samuel rode in from town at a hard trot, dust still settling behind him, and the look on his face was enough to bring the whole household spilling out onto the porch before he'd even swung down from the saddle. "Verdict's in," he said, breathless. "Territorial Court, Blackwell." Clara felt her stomach drop straight to her boots, and Cole's voice had gone tight-braced. "Convicted," Samuel said, and a grin cracked slow and wide across his weathered face. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy judge threw the whole book at him. Circle B's being sold off piece by piece to pay restitution to every family he ever ruined, starting with the Averils. Man's looking at 10 years in the territorial prison minimum. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Eli let out a whoop loud enough to startle the horses, and Jed Coyle sat down hard on the porch steps, like his legs had simply stopped working, and Clara found herself laughing and crying at once, gripping Cole's arm so tight her knuckles went white. "It's over," she said, half disbelieving even as she said it. "Cole, it's really over." "It's over," Cole agreed, voice rough, pulling her into him. Man spent a decade making sure nobody in this valley ever got to feel safe standing up to him. Took one woman with a sharp eye for numbers to make sure that decade was his last. "It took all of us," Clara said. "You, Samuel, Eli, Jed, Foster, and the surveyor and Thomas Averil's boy, standing up in that courtroom after 11 years of swallowing his grief alone." She looked around at the small, fierce, unlikely family gathered on that porch, every one of them changed by the fight they'd survived together. It took every person who finally decided they were done being afraid. Samuel, never a man given to sentiment, cleared his throat gruffly and looked away toward the ridge, blinking harder than the dust in the yard could rightly account for. "Best news I've had since your daddy handed me my first paycheck, Cole Harrison," he said. "Don't expect me to say it twice." "Wouldn't dream of asking you to," Cole said, clapping him on the shoulder, and for once, Samuel let the moment sit instead of shrugging it off. That evening's supper turned into something between a wedding rehearsal and a celebration nobody had planned for, and by the time the last plate was cleared, half the valley seemed to have found some excuse to stop by the ranch and offer congratulations on 2 counts at once: the wedding and the reckoning that had finally caught up to Victor Blackwell after 11 long years of getting away with everything. Thomas Averil's son arrived last near dusk and pulled Clara aside before he left. Something loosened and lighter in his face than she'd seen there since the courtroom. "My father would have liked you," he said simply. Man spent the last years of his life believing the world only rewarded people willing to look away. Glad he was wrong even if he never lived to see it proven. He wasn't wrong to hope somebody would, Clara said. He just needed the right somebody to come along and finish what he started. The wedding day dawned clear and cold and impossibly blue. The whole valley washed gold with the particular light that only came in early October, and Clara stood at the window of the small room that had once been hers alone. Now watching the yard fill slowly with wagons and neighbors, and the entire messy, wonderful weight of a community that had against every early sign decided to claim her as its own. Her hands shook, lacing the borrowed dress Mrs. Pruitt had astonishingly offered from her own daughter's wedding chest. Nervous. The voice belonged to a woman Clara had come to know these past months, not as a stranger, but as something closer to family, the wife of a neighboring rancher who'd taken Clara under her wing the moment the town's suspicion had finally cracked open into welcome. "Terrified," Clara admitted, laughing despite herself. "Isn't that strange? I fought a man who tried to burn down everything Cole built. I stood in front of a courtroom and a town square both, and it's this that has my hands shaking." "That's because the other fights were about surviving," the woman said gently, straightening the collar of Clara's dress with practiced hands. "This one's about choosing to be happy. That's a braver thing than most folks ever admit." Clara thought about that a long moment and found she couldn't argue with it. The ceremony was small and plain, held right there in the yard beneath the same October sky that had watched Clara arrive as a stranger 2 seasons before. And Clara walked toward Cole across ground she had scrubbed and fought and bled for, in her own quiet way, past Samuel standing proud as any father, past Eli grinning through unshed tears, past Jed Coyle standing straight and steady in a borrowed coat toward a man who had met her at a train station as a stranger delivering bad news, and had somehow in the space of 2 seasons become the whole shape of her future. Clara Whitmore, Cole said when it came his turn to speak, voice unsteady with something he no longer bothered hiding from anyone watching. I told you once that nobody ought to be left standing on a platform with nowhere to go. I didn't know then that the woman I was trying to help was about to become the reason I finally learned how to stop standing alone myself. Cole Harrison, Clara answered, and found her own voice steady despite the tears already spilling free. You told me I was allowed to be angry that first morning before you'd even properly met me. Nobody had ever given me permission to feel my own grief before. I didn't know yet that the same man who gave me that would spend the rest of his life giving me everything else I never knew I was allowed to want. The preacher's words that followed blurred into something Clara barely registered, too full of the moment to hold on to anything but the warmth of Cole's hands in hers. The particular hush of a whole valley, watching 2 people choose each other in the open light of day. When he finally kissed her, the whole yard erupted into the kind of noise only a town starved for good news could produce, and Clara laughed against his mouth, dizzy and certain, and entirely finally home. The celebration ran long into the evening lanterns, strung between the barn and the porch, fiddle music carrying out across the pasture, where cattle grazed peaceful and unbothered by the noise. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Clara found herself standing alone for a moment, at the edge of the yard, looking back at the house that had once smelled of dust and neglect, and now stood lit gold from every window, full of people who loved her. Cole found her there, as he always seemed to, and slipped his arms around her from behind. Regretting any of it, he murmured against her hair, though the teasing in his voice told her he already knew the answer. Not one single moment, Clara said. Not the platform, not the humiliation, not even the fear. Every bit of it led here. Even Nathaniel Carter, Cole asked, and she could hear him smiling. Especially Nathaniel Carter, Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. If he'd had the courage to meet that train himself, I'd have married a stranger's careful letters and never once known what it felt like to be chosen by a man brave enough to tell me a hard truth to my face and love me anyway once he had. Cole studied her a long moment in the lantern light. The same searching, careful look she'd first seen on a train platform 2 seasons ago, except now there was nothing uncertain left in it at all. They called you a mail-order bride, he said quietly. Like that was the whole of who you were. Like a woman crossing the country alone, brave enough to bet everything on a stranger's promise, was something small enough to fit inside 2 ugly words. And what do you call me now? Clara asked. Cole's answer came without a single moment's hesitation. Certain as the ground beneath them, certain as the valley stretching gold and endless beyond the lantern light. My wife, he said. My destiny, same as I always should have known you were from the very first morning you stepped off that train, and refused to let the whole world decide who you were before you'd said a single word for yourself. In the seasons that followed, the Harrison Ranch grew into something neither Cole nor his father before him had ever quite managed alone. Not merely bigger though it was that too. Water rights secure and cattle fat on grass, no one could threaten to poison again, but steadier, warmer, the kind of place neighbors sought out, rather than merely tolerated. Eli married his sweetheart the following spring right there in the same yard, and Samuel stood witness with something suspiciously bright in his eyes. He blamed unconvincingly on the dust. Jed Coyle earned a foreman's wages within the year and never once, not for a single day, took the chance for granted. The kitchen stayed loud and full and warm, exactly the way Clara had promised herself that very first ruined evening she would make it. And there, beneath a sky full of October stars, in a home she had built with her own 2 hands, out of nothing but grit and grief, and a stubborn refusal to be small, Clara Harrison understood fully and forever that she had never once been the bride nobody wanted. She had simply been waiting all along for the one man brave enough to want her exactly as she was.